Number 1. Mahmoud Abdul-Rauf. Formerly known as Chris Jackson, Mahmoud is often referred to as the Steph Curry before Steph Curry. From a skill set standpoint, it's not a bad comparison. This 6'1" guard had a remarkable handle on the basketball and was a lethal shooter all over the court, which was a potent combination for his offense. He was very cunning at misdirecting the defender, and he was fantastic with his ball fakes and shooting off the dribble. Like Steph, he also had an extremely quick release. He was one of the greatest free throw shooters in the history of the game, getting as high as 95.6% in 1994. Ultimately, despite his remarkable skill set, his career was cut short due to a variety of controversies unrelated to the actual basketball. To elaborate, he might be getting his own video at some point, but in the meantime, just know that he was one of the most offensively talented players in the 1990s. Number 2. Michael Adams. He was a 5'10" point guard with lots of style and flair. As a member of the Denver Nuggets in the early 90s, he was asked to lead a basketball team that wasn't very good. He absolutely loved the green light though, and at his peak, he averaged 26.5 points per game, while dishing out 10.5 assists on a nightly basis. He wasn't the most efficient from the field, as he only hit 41.5% of his field goal attempts over his career. But part of the reason for the lower percentages is because he was in love with a three-point shot. And in 1991, he attempted an insane 8.1 three-point attempts per game. For perspective, 2/3 of the teams in the league that year were not even attempting that many threes per game as a group. He may have made only one All-Star team in his career, but the undersized Adams was certainly one of the more skilled players of his era. Number 3. Nate "Tiny" Archibald. This 6'1" point guard is one of the more underappreciated weapons of NBA history. He spent his prime years as a member of the Kansas City Kings in the 1970s, and he was quite the dual threat. The best example of that was his peak season in 1973, where he averaged 34 points and 11.4 assists throughout the regular season. He did the incredibly rare feat of leading the NBA in both scoring and assists in the same season. What made him stand out was the combination of his fantastic mid-range shooting and his speed and shiftiness as a ball handler. Unfortunately, he tore his Achilles at the age of 28, and although he would continue to play in the NBA after the injury healed, he was never able to return to his elite form. With that being said, he did go on to win an NBA championship as a quality role player for the Boston Celtics in 1981. If you're having a discussion about the most dangerous players ever around 6 feet tall, then it would be criminal to not include Tiny Archibald. Number 4. Mark Aguirre. This 6'6" small forward was tremendously athletic and explosive upon entering the league. But as he aged, his game began to mellow out as he became more of a smooth and methodical mid-range player. Simply put, he's one of the most underrated scorers of all time. And for 6 seasons straight with the Dallas Mavericks, he averaged at least 22 points per game, getting as high as 29.5 on 52.4% shooting in 1984. This wasn't just empty stats either, as he led the Mavericks to the playoffs in 5 straight seasons, making it all the way to the Western Conference Finals in 1988, where they pushed the world champion Showtime Lakers to 7 games. Halfway through the 1988-89 season, the Mavericks made a blockbuster trade, sending Aguirre to the Pistons for Adrian Dantley. On a talented Detroit Pistons squad, Aguirre was forced to reduce his responsibilities from a superstar to a role player. With that being said, he had a tremendous impact offensively, and while pouring in over 14 points per game, his Pistons won back-to-back championships in his first 2 seasons as a part of the team. Regardless of whether you're looking at his time as a superstar or his time as a role player, he remains as one of the more underrated players of the past. Since his retirement, Gilbert Arenas has made a name for himself as a podcaster, a YouTuber, and as one of the most highly productive hot take machines in the media. I'm sure we all have various opinions on him as an analyst and as a podcaster, but that's not what this video is about. This video is about enlightening people on the value and legacy of Gilbert Arenas' basketball career. If you listen to Agent Zero talk about himself, you'd probably think he was one of the 75 greatest players of all time. But if you listen to the opinions of people who dislike him as an analyst, then you'd probably be convinced that he was a scrub who was nowhere close to being a legitimate superstar in the NBA. As someone who witnessed the entirety of his basketball career, my goal is to find the middle ground and give an accurate assessment on the quality of Arenas as a basketball player. So without further ado, let's get into it. Heading into the NBA, people didn't have tremendously high expectations for Arenas, as the 6'4" point guard was taken in the second round of the 2001 draft by the Golden State Warriors. His first season was a very modest debut in the league, as he only averaged 10 points on 45% shooting. With that being said, Gilbert is most famous for his time as a Wizard, and he didn't arrive in Washington until his third season in the league. This is where he would begin to establish himself as a legitimate threat in the league. When it comes to his skill set, he was a guy who was truly ahead of his time. If I'm being honest, I think he would be incredibly well suited to be a superstar player in modern 2023 basketball. He had a solid crossover dribble and a lethal pull-up jumper. In a way, I view him as a player who was similar to James Harden, in the sense that he was a volume shooter who loved taking step-back jumpers and who especially loved to take the majority of his shots from three-point distance. Also, in a way that's similar to Harden, Gilbert didn't have a very good field goal percentage. But when you combine that with his three-point shooting and his free throw shooting, he actually had a pretty decent true shooting percentage. Similar to an earlier star like Allen Iverson, Arenas was a flat-out gunner who could shoot you out of a game if he was having an off night, or he could lead you to a blowout victory with one of the most dangerous hot hands in the entire league. A perfect example of that was when he torched Kobe Bryant and the Los Angeles Lakers by scoring 60 points, which is the most points ever scored against a Kobe Bryant-led team. Now, during his prime years in Washington, he didn't have any deep postseason runs, and some say that's because Arenas didn't have the most solid supporting cast, which is certainly true, but that doesn't tell the whole story. Arenas was a score-first point guard who would look for his own shot before looking to provide a solid shot for his teammate. I have to bring up the James Harden comparison yet again, but in a way that's similar to Harden, you can only describe Arenas as an average defender at best, and honestly, even that is probably a little too generous. On a more positive note, it would have been interesting to see Arenas in more playoff situations with a more solid supporting cast. Because in a way that's similar to Damian Lillard, he was one of the best clutch shot makers in the entire league, who seemingly had limitless range. At his best in 2006, he averaged 29 points, 6 assists, and 3 rebounds on 58.1 true shooting percentage. Later on in the first round of the playoffs, his 5th-seeded Wizards were taking on the 4th-seeded Cavaliers, and what ensued was one of the greatest solo battles in playoff history between Gilbert Arenas and LeBron James. Both players showed up with their best efforts, and Game 5 specifically was an absolute classic, as Arenas dropped 44 points, 5 rebounds, and 4 assists on 58% shooting, while James put up 45 points, 7 rebounds, and 6 assists on 61% shooting. On the series as a whole, Arenas averaged 34, 5, and 5 on 46%, while LeBron averaged 35, 7, and 6 on 51%. Ultimately, it was LeBron's Cavs who won the series in 6 games. If anyone ever asks you to summarize how good Arenas was in his prime, you can simply tell them that he was good enough to go toe-to-toe with a young LeBron James in the playoffs. The following season, Arenas would again have a monstrous regular season, as he averaged 28 points, 6 assists, and 5 rebounds on 42% shooting. His Wizards finished with a 41-41 record, barely squeezing their way into the playoffs, and waiting for them again was LeBron James and the Cleveland Cavaliers. Unfortunately, Gilbert would not be a part of this series though, because with only 7 games left in the regular season, he tore his MCL. Without their leading star, the Wizards were swept by LeBron and the Cavs. This was the beginning of the downward spiral of Gilbert's career, because after the MCL tear at the age of 25, his body would never fully recover and allow him to return to his near 30 points per game form. To add insult to injury, Arenas had his famous weapons incident in December of 2009, where he and his teammate Javaris Crittenton both drew weapons on each other in the Wizards locker room. After pleading guilty to a felony offense of carrying an unlicensed weapon, the reputation of Arenas had taken a major hit. The drama and health issues were taking their toll, and in 2011 he was traded to the Orlando Magic, where he was paired up with an elite Dwight Howard. In theory, this should have been a dominant tandem in the Eastern Conference, but unfortunately, Arenas was just a shell of what he once was, as he only averaged 8 points on 34% shooting in his 49 games with the Magic. After a disastrous finale season with the Grizzlies, he had played his final game in the NBA at just the age of 30. So to recap, Arenas was a 3-time All-Star and he made 3 All-NBA teams. At his best, he was a player who would occasionally outplay the best the game had to offer, like Kobe Bryant and LeBron James. Although he was solid in the passing lanes and averaged a decent amount of steals, he was not a good on-ball defender by any means. Although he had stretches where he was an elite scorer, there's no question that he was a volume scorer as he shot a career 42.1% from the field. Some of that efficiency begins to balance out when you look at his true shooting percentage. But make no mistake, this guy was a shoot-first point guard in a similar way to a prime Allen Iverson. In his career, he never got past the second round of the playoffs, but you could certainly argue that this fact had more to do with his injuries and a lack of a solid supporting cast, rather than an actual indication of his weaknesses. If you ask me, I believe he was a much better player than a podcaster. But what I will not dispute is that whether it was on the court or off the court, this man has never been accused of being boring. That's for sure.
Richard Francis Dennis Berry III, one of the great legends of NBA and ABA history, who doesn't quite get the recognition his talent deserves. Berry is one of those players whose legacy suffers from the fact that he spent large portions of his career in both the NBA and the ABA. By the end of his career, he had many accolades and had accumulated many statistics, but when you split those totals between two different leagues, they tend to not stand out as much and are rarely brought up. But in order to fully appreciate the greatness of the world's greatest granny shot shooter, we have to start our evaluation at the beginning of his professional career. Berry was drafted with the second overall pick in the 1965 NBA draft by the San Francisco Warriors. The 21-year-old 6'7" small forward was immediately ready to live up to the high expectations. He had many skills, as he was a fantastic finisher around the rim and also a jump shooting sniper. The most iconic part of his game was his underhand free throw shooting. Other than the fact that this is a very rare shooting form, Berry's free throw shooting was famous for the fact that he was one of the most efficient shooters to ever do it, as he shot 89.3% over the course of his career, which is the 7th greatest of all time on the NBA/ABA list. In that rookie campaign, Berry put up numbers of 25.7 points, 10.6 rebounds, and 2.2 assists on 44% shooting, which was good enough to win the Rookie of the Year award. With this incredible debut season, he led the Warriors to more than double their win total from the previous season, going from only 17 wins to 35 wins, which was a great improvement, but still came up short of the playoffs. His second season would be a monumental leap forward, not just for Berry, but for the entire team as well. In a sense, Berry had statistically the most offensively dominant season from a forward in NBA history. That season, he averaged a massive 35.6 points, 9.2 rebounds, and 3.6 assists on 45% shooting. This was only his sophomore season in the league as a 22-year-old, and his 35.6 scoring average is still the 8th highest average for a season in NBA history. The only players to ever average more points in a single season was Wilt Chamberlain, Michael Jordan, and James Harden. Behind this incredible charge of Berry, the Warriors won 44 games to earn a playoff berth. In the playoffs, they swept the Lakers in the first round. They beat the St. Louis Hawks in the second round in 6 games, and then in the NBA Finals, they pushed the 68-win Philadelphia 76ers to 6 games before being eliminated. In that final series, Barry put up monstrous averages of 40.8 points, 8.8 rebounds, and 3.3 assists, including an epic 55-point and 12-rebound performance in Game 5. By the end of his second year, the sky was the limit for Rick. But that's when his career would start to get kind of weird and controversial. Barry was clearly the biggest reason for the Warriors' recent success, and he felt frustrated as he believed he hadn't been appropriately compensated in terms of his finances. Free agency did not exist in the NBA at this point, but there was another professional basketball league in the form of the ABA. The issue became a legal one, which resulted in Barry leaving the NBA for the ABA and ultimately being forced to sit out the entire 67-68 season. Although some recognized Barry's move as one where he was simply pursuing what he was worth, there were also plenty of people who now saw him as a selfish, money-hungry player. When he finally returned to action as a 24-year-old, he was a member of the Oakland Oaks, and it appeared as if he hadn't missed a beat. The Oaks made several big additions that year, and the team launched to 60 wins after winning only 22 the previous season. Unfortunately, Barry wasn't there for much of it. In the 35 games he played that year, he averaged 34 points, 9.4 rebounds, and 3.9 assists on 51% shooting. But nearly midway through the regular season, Barry collided with another player and tore ligaments in his left knee, and his season was over. From this point on, knee problems would be something that Barry would have to push through. As I mentioned earlier, the Oaks had a great team all around, not just Barry, and the team still went on to win the ABA championship even with arguably their best player out. Despite the team's success, the Oaks were still the less popular Bay Area basketball team behind the NBA's Warriors. So the Oaks owner sold the franchise, which was then relocated to Washington, D.C., where they became the Washington Caps. Once again, Barry was not thrilled about this situation, and for a while, he refused to report to the team, even going as far as saying, if I wanted to go to Washington, I'd run for president. Eventually, he was forced to join the team, where he then continued to put up his usual solid numbers. In the playoffs, they pushed the Denver Rockets to 7 games, and Rick averaged 40.1 points over the course of the series. But ultimately, despite a 52-point performance in Game 7, Barry and the Caps were still eliminated. Over the next few years, his rollercoaster career would continue to change its atmosphere and circumstances, yet he would continue his elite play and scoring, along with more of his controversy. By the summer of 1972, a United States District Court judge ruled that Barry would have to play for the team that drafted him, which was the Warriors of the NBA. So it was back to the NBA for Barry. His shining moment of his career would come just a couple years later, as he was entering what was arguably the best season of his career. As a 30-year-old who had battled through knee injuries, his game had evolved to be one that was dominating almost entirely from the perimeter, as many people consider him the original point forward. In that role, he averaged 30.6 points, 6.2 assists, 5.7 rebounds, and 2.9 steals on 46.4% shooting. He led the league in steals, free throw percentage, and was 6th overall in assists. He then led the Warriors through the playoffs as they beat the Sonics in 6 games, the Bulls in 7 games, and swept the heavily favored Washington Bullets in just 4 games, and Barry was named the Finals MVP. The champions headed into the next season as the favorites to win it all once again, and they appeared as if they were poised to do just that, as they won a league-best 59 games that regular season. But as usual, every triumphant moment from Barry is surrounded with drama. The Warriors made it to the Western Conference Finals where they were facing the Phoenix Suns. After 6 games, the series was tied at 3 games apiece, with the Warriors expected to win the 7th game on their home floor. The thing is, within the first 2 minutes of this game, Rick Barry and Ricky Sobers get into a huge fight. You may notice from the footage that none of Barry's teammates really come to his aid. Once the game reaches halftime, the Warriors are up by 6 points. But that's when Barry sees the footage and notices that none of his teammates had backed him up. For pretty much the rest of the second half, Barry then refuses to shoot the ball. He quickly passes it, and he seems apathetic, disengaged, and as if he's completely quit on his team. The Warriors blow the lead and end up losing the series in what might be the biggest stain on Barry's legacy. He would go on to play several more years and add to his career totals, but he would never return to his dominant glory days from this point on. Looking at the totality of his production from both pro leagues, he was a 12-time All-Star, he made 10 All-NBA, All-ABA teams, and easily has the greatest NBA final scoring average ever at 36.3, and Michael Jordan is a distant second at 33.6. When it comes to his talent and production, there's no question that Rick Barry is criminally underrated, and is one of the most dominant wing players of all time. When it comes down to how great he was as a teammate though, well, I'll leave that up to you guys to debate.
Number 5. Walt Bellamy. This 6'11 center is one of the players who's usually indirectly referred to as a plumber, as he played in the 1960s against Wilt Chamberlain and Bill Russell. Bellamy was incredibly skilled and a gifted center, who was an absolute force for the Chicago Packers on the day he entered the league. He had one of the greatest rookie seasons in NBA history, as he averaged over 31 points and 19 rebounds while leading the league in field goal percentage. Unfortunately, Bellamy didn't stay in the greatest shape throughout his career, which massively hindered him from having elite longevity. Regardless, at his peak, he was one of the great centers of generations past, and he's also proof that the general competition wasn't weak for Chamberlain and Russell in the 1960s.
Before we get into the video, I want to make a disclaimer. Obviously, it is impossible to know with complete certainty what kind of player Len Bias would have been, but I do think there's evidence that allows us to speculate, and that at the very least, we can make an educated guess on how good he would have been. So let's get into it. Len Kevin Bias. Most of you NBA fans are familiar with this young man's tragic story, but for those of you who are not, let me at least give you a quick recap. Bias was a 6'8" small forward / power forward who played 4 years in college for the University of Maryland. Bias's game was filled with potential, and he was one of the best players in all of college basketball, as he was a 2-time ACC Player of the Year. Bias was also famously known to have epic battles in college with Michael Jordan, as they often appeared as equals in terms of talent and performance, or at least very close to it. Bias was a highly coveted prospect heading into the 1986 NBA draft. Meanwhile, in the NBA, Magic Johnson's Lakers and Larry Bird's Celtics were the premier teams in the league. The Celtics went on to win the 1986 NBA championship, led by their stars Larry Bird, Kevin McHale, and Robert Parrish. That 86 Celtics team is still considered to this day as one of the greatest teams of all time. Fast forward to the NBA draft, and thanks to a trade a couple years earlier with the Seattle Supersonics, the Boston Celtics owned the second overall pick in the draft the same year they won the championship. Cleveland had the first overall pick and needed a big man, so they selected the future All-Star center Brad Daugherty. So with the second pick, the Boston Celtics selected their exciting forward of the future, Len Bias. Adding a future Hall of Famer to the all-time great and defending champion Celtics team appeared to be a solidifying factor in continuing this Boston dynasty. But then, less than 48 hours later, while he was at his college dorm room celebrating with his friends, Len Bias had a seizure and collapsed. Soon after medical attention arrived, it was confirmed that Bias had passed away at the age of 22. It was simply a coke overdose, making Len Bias the poster child of the NBA's terrible drug issues in the 1980s. Naturally, this tragedy has gone on to make Len Bias arguably the greatest what-if in NBA history. So now that we're all informed, let's get into the meat of this video. First off, let's talk about Bias's skills and establish what defined his game and what made him such a unique talent. As I mentioned earlier, Bias was a 6'8" wing who could switch between the 3 or 4 spot on the court. He was lean, but very muscular. As a 22-year-old, he hadn't fully grown into his man body yet, but he still appeared as if he was ready to bully grown men in the post once he hit the NBA. He was incredibly athletic with a remarkably high vertical leap, especially considering his size. Maybe his best quality was his beautiful and smooth mid-range jump shot. With his solid footwork, tall stature, long arms, and high 2-foot leap, his jump shots were extremely tough to contest. He was very efficient from the field as well, shooting about 54% over the course of his college career. He wasn't much of a playmaker or a facilitator, but his two great gifts were essentially his scoring and rebounding. These are the key aspects of his game that I want us to pay attention to. I spent a lot of time thinking about other players in basketball history who were similar to Bias in terms of their stature, strength, athleticism, position, their skill set, and even their numbers in college. Here's a few names I came up with: Dominique Wilkins, Larry Johnson, and Xavier McDaniel. Now let me make this clear before I continue. I think Bias would have been better than all of these guys, even Dominique, as great as he was. But what I'm doing is trying to get a basis to work from, looking at their college and pro statistics to give us kind of a general idea in what kind of a player we might be getting in Bias. All of these guys had varying degrees of great athleticism and strength, just like Bias. They were all pretty good scorers who had an offensive style similar to Bias as well. Take a look at the numbers from each of these stars from their last season in college. They all clearly had high expectations too, based on the fact that they were all top 4 picks in the draft. Notice their high scoring and rebounding numbers and also their lack of assists. Again, this is showing their similar tendencies. All of these players went on to be all-stars in the NBA, although Dominique was clearly on another level from the other two. In my opinion, Xavier McDaniel and Larry Johnson was Len Bias's floor. There's no way he wouldn't have been as good as these two players in the NBA, although like I said before, I think he likely would have been much better than both of them. The most comparable career I think he would have been to Dominique Wilkins. Both great leapers, similar footwork, same height, same hot spots on the court, and so on. Remember how I said Bias had epic scoring battles with Michael Jordan in college while they played for Maryland and North Carolina? Well, you know who had epic scoring battles in the pros with Jordan? Dominique Wilkins. This is what I envision for Bias as a pro, like Dominique 2.0 on the offensive side of the ball, averaging 26 to 32 points per game in the prime of his career while accumulating 8 to 10 rebounds a game. But I said he would be better than Dominique, but that wasn't because of the offensive side of the court, but the defensive side. Bias showed incredible potential in college with his defensive prowess. He could frustrate players, cause turnovers, had a tremendous wingspan, and was a terrific shot blocker, often blocking shots you would think would be out of his reach. Dominique didn't have that on the defensive end, not even close. Another thing about the solo duels in college between Bias and Jordan. Bias had arguably greater numbers in college than Jordan did, and based on their talent and what we saw from them on the floor, he appeared every bit as ready for the pros as Jordan did. And how ready was Jordan? Well, let's put it this way. In Michael's rookie year, he took the NBA by storm, averaging 28.5 points per game, 6 rebounds, and 6 assists on 51% shooting. If MJ is any indication, then Bias would have had a significant impact immediately upon entering the league. Which brings me to my next point. Bias was joining the fantastic Boston Celtics. The year he would have been a rookie, the Celtics went on to the NBA Finals where they lost in 6 games to the Los Angeles Lakers. If Bias was as good as I'm projecting him to be, then I can't possibly see how he wouldn't have been the difference in that series and helped the Celtics win their 2nd straight championship. Keep in mind, Larry Bird was the starting small forward and McHale was the starting power forward, so the plan likely would have been to bring Bias off the bench. But with Larry dealing with ongoing back problems and with McHale trying to push through the playoffs with a broken foot, there would have been plenty of minutes available for Bias to shine as a star and make his impact. In an interview with Bill Simmons, Larry said that if Bias had lived, he would have retired in 1988, meaning the passing of the torch would have happened very quickly between Bias and Bird. It's likely then that Jordan and Bias would have gone on to have many epic battles through the years in the Eastern Conference playoffs. One thing I'm almost sure of is that by the end of Bias's career, we wouldn't have seen him as just another one of those star players that Jordan kept from winning championships. Because like I said, I think the Celtics would have won the championship in his 1987 rookie season. So in recap, how good do I think Bias would have been? Well, essentially, Dominique on offense with a hint of Larry Johnson and Shawn Kemp, and significantly better than all of those guys on defense. Add on at least one championship ring, but maybe even a few if things went right. It's also important to keep in mind that he passed away from a coke overdose. If coke had continued to be an issue for him, it's possible that it could have screwed up his career even if he had lived. That has in fact happened with other great players in the NBA's history. But again, this is just my educated guess on the player he would have been. Let me know your educated guesses in the comments section.
Number 6. Chauncey Billups. In my opinion, this former Finals MVP doesn't usually get the credit he's worth. For a while, Billups was known as one of the most clutch players in the entire league, which appropriately earned him the nickname Mr. Big Shot. Throughout his career, he was respected as one of the most lethal three-point shooters in the league. But that wasn't his only major value, as Billups was a solid on-ball defender, which resulted in him making 2 all-defense teams as a member of the suffocating Detroit Pistons. Even after his prime years in Detroit, Billups maintained a high level of value as he led the Nuggets all the way to the Western Conference Finals in 2009 alongside of Carmelo Anthony. Number 7. Dave Bing. This longtime Piston is recognized as one of the 75 greatest players of all time. As a 6'3" point guard, he was a genuine star in the 1960s and 70s, and he had a tremendous amount of body control in midair. He was also fantastic at finding his way into the paint and finishing at the rim regardless of the contact. Although he usually looked to score for himself, you couldn't challenge him too closely at the rim, because he would almost always find the open teammate with his outstanding court vision. He loved to push the tempo, and he also had a reliable pull-up jumper that looked like it was something straight from the modern NBA. For his career, he was a 7-time All-Star and led the league in overall points in 1968, as he averaged 27.1 points on the season. He was one of those players who had the skills to play and compete in any era. Number 8. Tyrone Bogues. He was better known as Muggsy, and he's famous for being the shortest player to ever play in the NBA, standing at only 5'3" tall. With that being said, Muggsy earned his spot, as he made an impact on the court in several ways. For one, he was a remarkable ball handler, and a tremendous playmaker with great court vision, and at his best, he averaged as high as 10.7 assists in 1990, which was 4th in the league overall. 4 years later, he was 2nd overall with 10.1 assists per game. With his small frame and with his ability to get low on the dribbler, Muggsy was also a bit of a nuisance on defense, as he averaged 1.5 steals over the course of his career, getting as high as 2.1 in 1992. He never made an all-star team, and of course, he was a bit of a liability when it came to his shot contention, but you would be a fool to assume that his spot on an NBA roster was just an act of charity. Number 9. Mookie Blaylock. This 6-foot point guard was a major pest throughout the 90s, and his nickname was the Thief for obvious reasons. Mookie was one of the greatest stealers of the basketball that the game has ever seen, as he led the league in steals per game twice in 1997 and in 1998. In total, he made 6 all-defense teams, which is the 6th most among point guards in NBA history. You would be wrong if you assumed that this was his only skill though, as he was a decent scorer and a very quality facilitator. He only made 1 all-star team, and I definitely wouldn't describe him as a superstar, but going up against Blaylock was always a tough assignment for every point guard in the league. Number 10. Fred Brown. He was most commonly referred to as Downtown Freddie Brown. This 6'3" guard was a key offensive contributor for the Seattle Supersonics championship run in 1979, and although he didn't shoot a tremendous volume of 3-point shots, he was one of the most efficient to do it. When the NBA introduced the 3-point shot in 1980, only 3 players in the league shot better than 40% from the 3-point line, and they were Larry Bird, Chris Ford, and Downtown Freddie Brown, who led the league overall with 44.3% from deep. From nearly everywhere on the court, he had an extremely dangerous pull-up jumper with a very quick release, making it quite difficult to defend. At his peak, he averaged 23.1 points in 1976, which was the season he made his only All-Star appearance. Number 11. Sam Cassell. Back in my day, we knew this point guard as Sam I Am. He was a confident and notorious trash talker, but he also could score and facilitate with the best of them. Few people know this, but Cassell was actually the player who first introduced the big ball stance to the NBA, which Kobe Bryant and LeBron James have since imitated. At his best, he was averaging as high as 20 points per game and 9 assists per game. And although he was a bit of a journeyman throughout his playing career, he actually started and ended his career with championships, as he won 2 with Hakeem Olajuwon as a member of the Houston Rockets, and then he won in 2008 as a role player for the Big Three Boston Celtics. I certainly would never describe him as a former superstar point guard, but as far as elite floor generals go, he was a tier below the very best. Number 12. Tom Chambers. Chambers is one of the greatest scorers that no one talks about. This 6'10" power forward was an absolute athletic force throughout the 80s and the early 90s. Many of his best years were in Seattle as a member of the Supersonics, but his absolute peak was in Phoenix in 1990, when he averaged 27 points and 7 rebounds on 50% shooting throughout the regular season. And then he followed it up by leading his Suns all the way to the Western Conference Finals before they were eliminated by the Blazers in 6 games. One of the biggest moments of his career in that season was when he exploded for 60 points on 69% shooting against his former Sonics team. But what's easily the most iconic moment of his career was when he destroyed Mark Jackson, elevating high above the rim to complete one of the greatest dunks in basketball history. Maurice Cheeks. Mo Cheeks was one of those all-star point guards who did a little bit of everything. He was the Philadelphia 76ers floor general in the 1980s, and he was a key star for their dominating championship run in 1983. Cheeks didn't do a tremendous amount of scoring as he averaged 11.1 points over his career, but what he chipped in, he did extremely efficiently for a point guard, as he shot a career 52.3%. He was a quality facilitator, getting as high as 9.2 assists per game in 1986, but his greatest strength was his pickpocket skills. For the first 10 seasons of his career, Cheeks finished in the top 10 in steals per game, and currently, he's 6th on the NBA's all-time list in total steals. Thanks to his tenacious tendencies, he made a total of 5 all-defense teams throughout his career. Let me be clear, he was never on the level of Magic Johnson and Isaiah Thomas's greatness, but it wouldn't be a stretch to say that Mo Cheeks was an elite point guard in his day. Michael Cooper. Cooper was one of the more underrated pieces of the Lakers Showtime era of the 1980s. He was actually one of the first 3-and-D players in NBA history, as he was a consistent beneficiary of Magic Johnson's elite court vision. Not only was he a consistent threat from downtown, but for a while, he actually held the NBA Finals record for the most three-pointers made in a Finals game. He was also sneaky athletic, as he was often Magic's go-to teammate for the alley-oop pass, which was quickly coined as the Koopaloop. By far, his greatest skill, though, was his all-time great defense. Cooper made a remarkable 8 all-defense teams, which is the second most in Lakers franchise history, trailing only Kobe Bryant. But unlike Kobe, Cooper actually won the Defensive Player of the Year award, which he did while coming off the bench in 1987. Dave Cowens. There are many legendary faces in the history of the Boston Celtics, and the most famous of them all was the championship-winning center Bill Russell. With that being said, he wasn't the only legendary winning center that they've had, as the great Dave Cowens did some dominating of his own in the 1970s. Cowens was a physically punishing force under the rim, averaging as high as 20 points per game and 16 rebounds per game. He made 3 all-defense teams, was the league MVP in 1973, and he won 2 championships as arguably the best player on his team. On many other organizations, he'd be known as the most famous player in franchise history, but as a member of the Boston Celtics, he remains as one of the most under-recognized to this very day. Louie Dampier. In the history of basketball, you could argue that no player has ever been more ahead of his time than Louie Dampier. This 6-foot point guard did play his final 3 seasons in the NBA after the merger in 1976, but he made a name for himself before that in the ABA. Louie finished his ABA career as the league's all-time leading scorer with well over 13,000 points, and he averaged as high as 26 points per game in 1970. He was a great scorer and shooter in many aspects, but the part that really made him ahead of his time was his three-point shooting. Decades ago, most three-point shooters were simply spot-up or catch-and-shoot players, but Louie was different. He would shoot three-pointers in a variety of ways, including in transition, which was completely unheard of at the time. Louie never saw a decent look that he didn't like, as he had a green light like no one else from his era. In 1969, he was shooting a whopping 7.1 three-point attempts per game. For perspective, entire ABA and NBA teams were not averaging 7.1 three-point attempts per game until 22 years later in the 1991 season. This legend was pulling the trigger from deep with the frequency of a modern superstar. but he was doing it in the 1960s. Truly a player who doesn't get enough recognition. Adrian Dantley. In my opinion, he's one of the most under-recognized and underappreciated scorers of all time. If you were not winning championships in the 1980s, then it was hard to get noticed in a talent-packed era, with teams like the Celtics, Lakers, Pistons, and 76ers drawing all of the attention. In his prime years, Dantley was the leading superstar of the Utah Jazz. His absolute bread and butter was his nearly automatic mid-range jumper. He was a very fundamentally sound and methodical player, and this resulted in some truly stunning numbers. Over a 4-season stretch from 1981 to 1984, Dantley averaged 30.5 points, 6.1 rebounds, and 4 assists on an absurdly accurate 56.4% shooting. Consistently averaging north of 30 while hitting over 55% of his shots is a truly impressive feat for a dominant center, but for a 6'5" small forward, that's basically unheard of. The unfortunate reality is that Dantley's legacy is that he was one of the most unlucky players of all time, as he was traded away from the Lakers right before they won the championship in 1980, and he was traded away from the Pistons right before they won the championship in 1989. Regardless of his ringless legacy, don't lose track of the fact that Dantley was certainly one of the most talented players throughout the 1980s. Baron Davis. This 6'3" point guard spent his best days with the Hornets and Warriors, as he was the leader of the famous We Believe Warriors in 2007 that went on to upset the first-seeded Dallas Mavericks in the first round. Davis was an explosive guard who was definitely a quality facilitator, but to me, he always came across as a score-first player. Despite being a relatively shorter player, Davis was a thunderous finisher around the rim, punishing many bigs who would dare to challenge him. Along with his remarkable athleticism, he was also great at causing turnovers, as he led the NBA in steals twice, with a career average of 1.8 per game. He wasn't without some weaknesses though, and although he got as high as 23 points per game in 2004, he was a bit of an inefficient volume scorer, as he was only a 40.9% shooter from the field. He was also plagued with injuries throughout his playing days, which caused him to miss far more games than your average star player. With that being said, Davis was a 2-time All-Star and a dangerous player who was capable of taking over games in the fourth quarter. Darryl Dawkins. Although his name is Darryl, he's more frequently referred to as Chocolate Thunder. It was a very fitting nickname, as this 6'11" center was notorious for his thunderous slams. On a few occasions, his slams were so powerful that they actually delayed the game entirely, as he shattered the backboard twice in a span of 3 weeks. Now, he was never considered as a superstar, but in his best years in Philadelphia, he was certainly a key contributor, getting close to averaging a double-double in nearly 30 minutes per game, and he was regularly among the league leaders in field goal percentage, as he hit a stellar 57.2% of his shots throughout his playing days. It wasn't all positive though, as Dawkins had a nasty habit of getting in foul trouble, as he averaged 3.8 personal fouls over the course of his career, which is tied for the 6th highest average in NBA history. Sloppiness in general was an issue, as he also turned the ball over more than you'd like to see from the center position. His career should have lasted longer than it did, but because of a series of back injuries, he only played in a total of 26 regular season games in his final 3 seasons, and by the age of 32, he had played his final game in the NBA.
Clyde the Glide Drexler, one of the great perimeter players of the late 80s and early 90s. This guy has been one of the most requested videos from my viewers, and the main reason is because the older generation who actually witnessed him play seem to think he was a greater player than the people who have simply heard of him. So in this case, how good was Clyde Drexler really is a very legitimate question. Today we'll be evaluating his career, talent, and legacy starting from the beginning of his NBA days. Clyde Drexler was selected with the 14th overall pick in the 1983 draft by the Portland Trail Blazers. His talent was recognized, but few saw his actual superstar potential, and that in large part is why he wasn't a top 10 pick. Clyde was a lengthy 6'7" shooting guard with incredible athleticism and leaping ability who had a tendency for attacking and finishing around the rim. As his career progressed, he also became a solid three-point shooter. With that being said, his career got off to a slow start. In his rookie campaign, he was coming off the bench playing only 17 minutes a game, averaging 7.7 points, 2.9 rebounds, and 1.9 assists on 45.1% shooting. The Blazers finished off that year with a 48-34 record before they were eliminated in the first round in 5 games to the Phoenix Suns. Drexler hadn't given the Portland organization much reason yet to be committed to him, which brings us to the 1984 NBA Draft. The Blazers were desperate for a legitimate center, which at the time was seen as something that's very necessary for a team to have in order to compete for championships. The Blazers, being not yet overly impressed by Drexler, offered the second overall pick and Drexler to the Houston Rockets for their superstar big man, Ralph Sampson. The Rockets already had the first overall pick, meaning that if this trade went through, they would have had the first pick, the second pick, and Clyde Drexler, and in all likelihood, they would have taken Hakeem Olajuwon first and Michael Jordan second, forming what would have been the greatest big three of all time. The Rockets thought about it and ultimately decided not to accept the trade, which they'll regret for the rest of eternity. The reason I mention this is because it's a key aspect to Drexler's legacy. If the trade had gone through, he certainly would have won more in the long run, but he also would have been relegated to a third option, and we probably wouldn't look back on him as an alpha superstar. The Blazers instead passed up on Jordan and took Sam Bowie second overall as the center they hoped would dominate moving forward. Sadly, he would have numerous injuries, turned out to be a bust, and was not at all the help that Drexler would need moving forward. Despite the missed opportunities, Drexler improved his game and stats across the board, and his team would advance further as a result. In that sophomore year, he averaged 17.2 points, 6 rebounds, 5.5 assists, and 2.2 steals on 49.4% shooting. His Blazers made it to the second round before being eliminated in 5 games by the eventual champion Los Angeles Lakers. He would continue to slowly improve over time, but it wasn't until his 5th year in the league that he reached his full potential as an elite star, as he averaged 27 points, 6.6 rebounds, and 5.8 assists on 50.6% shooting. These fantastic numbers may represent Drexler's best season, but it was only good enough to make him the second best shooting guard in the league. And honestly, that's the issue that made him so underappreciated, was his timing. It's hard to give Drexler much attention for putting up 27, 6, and 6 when Jordan is simultaneously putting up 35, 8, and 8 from the same position while being the MVP and the Defensive Player of the Year. Clyde Drexler isn't appreciated enough by fans today, but the sad truth is, he wasn't even fully appreciated when he was in his prime. From 1988 to 1992, Clyde continued his steady production in his best 5-year stretch of his career from a statistical standpoint, putting up 24.8 points, 6.9 rebounds, 6 assists, 2.2 steals on 49% shooting. His Blazers also made the NBA Finals twice in that 5-year run. The first time came in the 1990 season, where they eventually lost in 5 games to the repeat champion Detroit Pistons, but it certainly wasn't Drexler's fault that they couldn't get it done, because he was a monster in that series, scoring 26.4 points, 7.8 rebounds, and 6.2 assists on 54.3% shooting. The second time came in 1992 when they pushed Jordan's Bulls to 6 games. Unfortunately, this would be the last time that Clyde's Blazers would seriously contend for a title, and after his team would continue to decline for a few more years, Drexler had had enough and had asked for a trade midway through the 1994-95 season. His request was granted, and he was traded to the defending champion yet struggling Houston Rockets. The Rockets were entering those playoffs as an underdog 6-seeded team. Hakeem Olajuwon was clearly the best player throughout the playoffs, but that season he couldn't have done it without Drexler, who was huge throughout the playoffs, particularly in the first round against the Jazz, where he averaged 25, 7, and 5 on 58% shooting, and in the finals against the Magic, where he averaged nearly 22, 10, and 7 on 45% shooting. Those next few seasons with Houston would be his last, but by the end of his career, he was a former MVP candidate, an NBA champion, a 10-time All-Star, an Olympic gold medalist with the '92 Dream Team, and he was selected in 1996 as one of the 50 greatest players of all time. Very rarely do you hear people praise Clyde for his defense, but he was certainly more than capable, and with his quick hands and instincts, he was often among the league leaders in steals per game. Simply put, he was a winner, a big game performer, and one of the greatest and most underappreciated shooting guards who's ever played the game. Let me know in the comments section where you rank Clyde the Glide Drexler among the greatest shooting guards of all time.
Joe Dumars. This 6'3" shooting guard is one of the more underrated two-way players in basketball. The bad boy Detroit Pistons of the 1980s were led by Isaiah Thomas, but at the time, there was no question that their second best player was Joe Dumars. He had a smooth and reliable pull-up jumper, and he averaged as high as 23.5 points in 1993. Other than Dennis Rodman, he was the Pistons' best defensive player, as he made 5 all-defense teams in Detroit and was the man assigned to guard the dynamic Michael Jordan. Dumars was also known to be a clutch performer, and in the 1989 NBA Finals, he averaged 27.3 points and 6 assists on 57.6% shooting, as he picked the Showtime Lakers defense apart. Thanks to this epic performance, he was rewarded with the Finals MVP. Too often, people talk about the bad boy Detroit Pistons without bringing up Joe Dumars, but that would be like talking about the Bulls dynasty without mentioning Scottie Pippen. You just can't do that while giving the team its proper respect. T.R. Dunn. This 6'4" shooting guard spent the majority of his years as a member of the contending Denver Nuggets in the 1980s. That Nuggets team was known primarily as an elite high-scoring offense, and for their complete disregard of the defensive end of the court. That team was the embodiment of the term "the best defense is double the offense." The one exception on that roster was their elite wing defender, Theodore Roosevelt Dunn. Dunn was always the player assigned to guard the elite scorers like Michael Jordan and Clyde Drexler, and he usually did an excellent job of such. Regardless of the fact that Denver was arguably the worst defensive team overall, Dunn stood out individually as he made 3 straight all-defense teams from 1983 to 1985. He was never a great offensive player, and you certainly wouldn't describe him as a star, but he's definitely one of the more forgotten elite defenders of the 1980s. Mark Eaton. This towering monstrosity wasn't just a solid rim protector, but he was one of the most intimidating shot blockers that the game has ever seen. You could even make the argument that he was the best shot blocker since Wilt Chamberlain. Don't believe me? Well, let me tell you a little bit more about him. Mark was a 7'4" center who spent his entire career on the Utah Jazz. In total, he made 5 all-defense teams and won the Defensive Player of the Year in 1985 and in 1989, making him one out of only 7 centers who have won the award multiple times. Over the course of his career, he averaged an insane 3.5 blocks per game, which is the highest career average of all time. But what's even more impressive than that was his peak. He also has the highest single-season blocks per game average in NBA history, at a jaw-dropping 5.6 per game, which he did in 1985. For perspective, that was more than doubled what Akeem Olajuwon averaged that season, who happens to be the all-time leader in blocked shots. Mark led the NBA in blocks 4 times, which is tied with Kareem Abdul-Jabbar for the most of all time. He was definitely a specialist on the court, since his rebounding was only decent and he certainly wasn't a great scorer. But as far as great rim protection goes, it doesn't get much better than Mark Eaton. Sean Elliott. There have been many great players in Spurs history who have contributed to championships, like Duncan, Robinson, Parker, Leonard, and Ginobili. But one of them that almost never gets mentioned, but should, is the 6'8" small forward Sean Elliott. Throughout the 90s in San Antonio, this man was known as the Ninja, and he was always a scoring threat that had to be respected. On one hand, he was an athletic and explosive slasher who had handles and the hops to finish at the rim with style. On the other hand, he was an elite three-point shooter that you should never give too much space on the perimeter. At his peak, he was averaging 20 points and 5 rebounds per game in 1996, and he was known to make many clutch shots for the Spurs in the postseason. but none were more iconic than the Memorial Day miracle in Game 2 of the 1999 Western Conference Finals. Down 2 with the game on the line, Elliott kept his toes in bound as he hit the game-winning three-point shot, which many Spurs fans see as the symbolic image for the beginning of their dynasty. Dale Ellis. Throughout his career, this 6'7" wing was a bit of a journeyman, playing for many franchises in his 17 seasons. But with that being said, he was an absolute bucket in his prime years in Seattle, averaging as high as 27.5 points in 1989. Generally, he was a great scorer, but his greatest gift was certainly his three-point shooting, as he was regularly among the league leaders in three-point attempts and in three-point efficiency. He won the NBA's three-point contest in 1989 and was usually Larry Bird's greatest threat in those competitions. Unfortunately, the inflation in three-point attempts over the last decade has resulted in players like Ellis becoming overlooked as time has gone on. But make no mistake, he was one of the greatest three-point shooters to ever live. LaPhonso Ellis. This 6'8" power forward was an electrifying player who consistently provided energy and intensity. Two things you could always expect from him was hustle and attitude, which made him a perfect fit for a youthful Denver Nuggets team in the mid-1990s. On offense and defense, he was a high flyer who provided plenty of mesmerizing highlights with his vicious slams and with his punishing blocks, which includes arguably the greatest block in NBA history, when he straight up ripped the ball from Brian Davis. At his best, he was averaging 22 points and 7 rebounds in 1997. He was definitely a quality player, yet he never made a single All-Star team. But with that being said, the guy was a walking highlight every time he set foot on the court.
Throughout the 1980s, there were many incredible scorers, but one terrific player scored more points in that decade than any other player of the 80s. It wasn't the great Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, it wasn't Dominique Wilkins, and it wasn't Larry Bird. The one player who scored more points in the 1980s was none other than Alex English. Some of you may be asking, Alex who? Alex English was a slim 6'7" forward with a silky smooth jump shot with a high release point that was extremely hard to defend. English played 15 seasons in the NBA from 1976 to 1991. He played for the Bucks, Pacers, Nuggets, and Mavericks, although the majority of his career and the entirety of his prime was spent playing as a Denver Nugget. English was also one of the most reliable superstars in the league throughout his career. From his sophomore season to his final year, he never missed more than 4 games in an NBA season. He was dependable, he was consistent, and he was lethal. During Alex's best 8-year stretch in the league from 1981 to 1989, he averaged 27.3 points, 5.4 rebounds, and 4.7 assists on 51.2% shooting. If you're not able to grasp just how remarkable these numbers are, let's observe this comparison. During Kobe Bryant's best 8-year stretch of his career from 2002 to 2010, he averaged 29 points, 5.8 rebounds, 5.3 assists on 45.3% shooting. English's points, rebounds, and assists were only slightly lower than Kobe's during their primes, but English was also much more efficient while doing his production. Now, I'm not saying that because of this, English is as great of a player as Kobe, but just the fact alone that their stats were comparable is enough to appreciate the greatness of Alex English, and this helps us begin to recognize just how criminally unrecognized this legend actually is. His greatness has gone unappreciated for several reasons. For one, Alex wasn't much of a flashy player. He wasn't very athletic, he wasn't the fastest, and he didn't have the most spectacular dunks. The reality is the guy wasn't much of a highlight machine, but he was great fundamentally with solid footwork, good shot selection, and a high offensive IQ. Despite the value of those quality attributes, it's not the type of playstyle that's remembered fondly and leaves an imprint on people. He was a mid-range player who shot mid-range jumper after mid-range jumper after mid-range jumper. Over the course of his career, English averaged a mere 0.1 three-point shot attempts per game. To make it clear how much English preferred the mid-range game, Alex shot 21,036 shots in his career, and a whopping 83 of those attempts were three-point shots. It was one of the most predictable and even boring offensive skill sets the league has ever seen, yet because of his length and extremely high release point, defenders couldn't stop him, even though they knew what was coming. Another reason Alex is overlooked is because, like many other legends, he didn't win a championship during his career. English led his Denver Nuggets to be contenders multiple times in the Western Conference. They at times had a pretty talented team with guys like Kelvin Knott and Lafayette Lever. With that being said, getting past Magic, Kareem and Worthy's Lakers, or Ralph Sampson and Hakeem's Rockets takes an all-time great team, and the 80s Nuggets certainly weren't on that level. It's not like Alex was a flawless superstar though. He was an all-time great offensively, but he wasn't all that great as a defensive player. In fact, his entire Nuggets team was horrible defensively throughout the 80s. They were a run-and-gun team that simply tried to outscore their opponents and basically ignored the defensive side of the ball. Mike D'Antoni would be proud. At one point, statistically speaking, the Nuggets were the worst team in the league defensively for 4 consecutive seasons. Sure, English and the Nuggets would light up the scoreboard on a nightly basis, but so did their opponents. No game summed this up any better than the regular season game on December 13, 1983 versus the Detroit Pistons. There was absolutely no defense in this game, and the game ended in triple overtime with the Pistons defeating the Nuggets 186-184. Even with all of that being said, English continued to be an offensive monster, and his offensive game aged extremely well. As a 36-year-old, English averaged 26.5 points, 4 rebounds, and 4.7 assists per game on 49.1% from the field, and remarkably, he played all 82 games that season. This was easily one of the greatest seasons in NBA history by a player above the age of 35. For his career, he scored 25,613 points. He was remarkably efficient in getting all of those buckets as well, as he shot 50.7% from the field over his career, which is an even greater shooting percentage than the shooting percentages of Michael Jordan and LeBron James. In fact, out of all the wing players in NBA history to reach 25,000 points for their career, Alex English is the most efficient player in that group. When it comes to shot selection, skills, and fundamentals, there's a lot to learn from English's offensive game, and all of this contributes to why I see him as one of the most underrated players of NBA history.
Michael Finley. From the late 90s to the mid-2000s, he was usually the Mavericks' second leading scorer behind Dirk Nowitzki, and he was a massive contributor to their top-seeded teams. Finley was a 6'7" small forward who was an above-the-rim athlete, and he was quite the slasher. But beyond that, he was also an elite three-point shooter in his prime, getting as high as 40.7% in 2005. He was an absolute workhorse, as he led the NBA in minutes per game in 3 separate seasons, and specifically in the 2002 playoffs, he played 46.6 minutes per game, which is insane even by the standards of that era. He was a 2-time All-Star and averaged at least 20 points per game in 5 consecutive seasons. In a roundabout way, Dirk's championship in 2011 kinda made people forget about some of the great teammates he had in the years before that, and Finley was one of the better ones. Walt Frazier. Many people know the name, but a lot seem to be unaware of his incredible skills. Clyde Frazier was a 6'4" point guard who was one of the best two-way players of his era. On offense, he was a very intelligent floor general, who had a silky smooth handle of the basketball and was very crafty with his passes. On defense, he was an absolute pest, who had great on-ball defense, but he also had great instincts, as he was always jumping the passing lanes. In total, he made 7 all-defense teams and was an all-star player during both of New York's championship runs in the 1970s. In a way, he was basically the Gary Payton of the 1970s. But in the modern basketball discussions, he's not usually given that much credit. Steve Francis. As a 6'3" point guard, he was extremely similar to greats like Derrick Rose and Russell Westbrook, in the sense that they were explosive and thunderous finishers at the rim despite their lack of size. He could be considered as one of the greatest what-ifs of basketball history, as he came into the league out of Maryland as the second overall pick, and in the year 2000, he was honored with the NBA's Rookie of the Year award. But unfortunately, he never truly reached the peak of his potential due to injuries, and by the age of 31, he had played his final game in the league. He earned 3 straight All-Star selections and averaged about 26-6 in that time frame. With his solid handle and with his tremendous athleticism, Stevie Franchise could have been a legitimate star in just about any era. World Be Free. In the 70s and 80s, this guy was an absolute bucket getter, as he was always a threat in transition with one of the best pull-up jumpers that the game had to offer. He was known for his quote rainbow shots due to the extreme arc on the ball from his jumpers. As an undersized 6'2" shooting guard, he had his mind set on one thing, and that was scoring in bunches. He was an efficient three-point shooter at a time when there wasn't many of them. At his peak in 1980, he averaged 30 points on solid shooting splits, and the highlight of that season was when he torched Magic Johnson in his career debut by dropping 46 points, 7 rebounds, 5 assists, and 7 steals on 65% shooting, naturally making it one of the most brutal welcome to the NBA moments. Unfortunately, the prime of his career was spent on either bad or mediocre teams, like the Clippers and Warriors, so he was never competing for championships at his apex. Regardless, he was one of the most talented players of his era who is certainly worth remembering.
George the Iceman Gervin, one of the greats of NBA history. He was nicknamed the Iceman for his cool play style and his demeanor on the court. George is the greatest San Antonio Spur that you rarely hear about. The Iceman was voted as one of the NBA's 50 greatest players of all time. He was a 6'7" wing who dominated the league offensively, and oftentimes it was with his iconic finger roll. He had a terrific basketball IQ and was known for his quality shot selection. Between his years in the ABA and the NBA, Gervin scored over 26,000 points while shooting over 50% for his career. When people talk about the greatest scorers of all time, who are the names that typically come up? From my experience, they usually say guys like Jordan, Kareem, Chamberlain, Durant, Kobe, and James Harden, and all of those are great names. But one of the names I almost never hear get mentioned in that group is the Iceman, George Gervin, and that is a crime because he definitely belongs in that group. Unfortunately, a lot of great scorers of the 1970s are often overlooked, and there's an easy explanation for that. Great scorers like George Gervin, Rick Barry, and Julius Erving spent some years in the NBA and some years in the ABA, but when people often bring up the all-time scoring list, it only accounts for NBA scoring, meaning all those buckets they got during the ABA years are essentially ignored, and these greats should be way higher on the list of all-time scoring leaders. So just how good was George Gervin really? Well, let's take it back to the beginning of his career as we travel through his progression and his accomplishments. In the year 1972, Gervin was scouted and signed by an ABA team, the Virginia Squires. As a 20-year-old, he had a decent rookie campaign as he averaged 14.1 points and 4.3 rebounds. But it wasn't until his second season that he truly broke out as a star. In his sophomore year in the ABA, he averaged 23.4 points, 8.4 rebounds, 1.4 steals, and 1.6 blocks on 47% shooting. As many of you know, the popularity of professional basketball in the 70s wasn't what it is today, and the Virginia Squires were one of the organizations struggling financially, and they were trying desperately to stay afloat, so they traded their star in Gervin to the San Antonio Spurs for $228,000. It was there in San Antonio where Gervin would go on to build his legacy. In 1976, the NBA merged with the ABA, which moved Gervin's Spurs to the NBA, and this is where he first started to accumulate his NBA statistics. This merger perfectly coincided with the beginning of his prime. During the prime of his career from 1977 to 1984, he averaged a remarkable 28.8 points, 4.9 rebounds, 3 assists, and 1.3 steals on 51% shooting. During this stretch, with his silky smooth style and his ability to finish around the rim with incredible precision, he led the league in scoring 4 times. In case you're not grasping just how impressive this is, let me put it this way. That's the 3rd most scoring championships in NBA history. The only players with more scoring crowns than Gervin is Michael Jordan and Wilt Chamberlain. That's it. Among his noteworthy scoring performances was his final game of the regular season in 1978. George Gervin was heading into this day with a slight lead as the league leader in scoring over David Thompson, but then Thompson proceeded to drop 73 points in his final regular season game and took the scoring lead from Gervin. George was going to need to score 59 points that evening if he wanted to take the scoring crown back from Thompson. Turns out, he nearly did that by halftime. Gervin was so determined that he exploded for 33 points in the second quarter alone, which at the time was an NBA record. He dropped 53 points in the first half. He ended up with 63 points on only 33 minutes played, because that's all it took. The game was completely meaningless from a playoff seeding standpoint, so he sat out some of the third quarter and all of the fourth quarter. If he played those minutes, he definitely could have scored into the 80s or possibly even 90-point territory. That's how dangerous he could be when he got going. His best year overall came in the 79-80 season, where he averaged 33.1 points per game while shooting 52.8% from the field. Other than Michael Jordan, no wing player in NBA history has ever averaged that many points while shooting above 50% from the field for the season. His best seasons were in the early 80s, where he led his Spurs to be contenders in the Western Conference. Unfortunately, he went down as one of the NBA greats who was never able to win a championship, and a big reason for that was simply because the timing was bad, considering the Lakers were in the middle of their dynasty run. Several times they ran into Kareem and Magic's Lakers in the Western Conference Finals, but they were never able to beat the juggernaut of Los Angeles. In the final year of his career, which was the 85-86 season, he was a member of the Chicago Bulls and a teammate of a young Michael Jordan. The team didn't live up to the hype, as Jordan spent most of the season dealing with a broken foot, and although George was still decently productive, he was well past his prime at this point. For the totality of his career, he was a 12-time All-Star, made 7 All-NBA teams, and 2 All-ABA teams. For his NBA career, he finished with averages of 26.1 points, 4.6 rebounds, 2.8 assists, and 1.2 steals on 51.1% shooting. Another incredible fact about his numbers is that other than LeBron James, he's the only wing player in NBA history to have a career average of over 25 points per game while shooting over 50% from the field for his career. Again, this is just another reason why it's completely asinine that this man almost never gets any attention when discussing the greatest scorers of all time. So just how good was he? Well, he was never anything special defensively, so you can't say he's one of the greatest two-way players ever, but as far as just a pure score, you could make a legitimate argument that he's in the top 5 of all time.
Artis Gilmore. Most kids nowadays know this guy as the starting center of the Bulls' all-time team in NBA 2K, but he's worth way more recognition than just that. This 7'2" tower was a legendary center in Chicago, but arguably his peak was well before that in the ABA. In only his rookie season in the American Basketball Association, he averaged an absurd 24 points, 18 rebounds, 3 assists, and a whopping 5 blocks. Not only was he the best of the rookie class, but that performance led him to win the MVP award. He led the league in field goal percentage 6 times. He led the league in rebounding 4 times. He made 11 All-Star teams, 5 All-Defense teams, and was an ABA champion with Kentucky in 1975. There's a lot of underrated centers in basketball history, but without a doubt, Gilmore is in the debate for being the most underrated. Gail Goodrich. He's one of the least recognized Laker legends, and that kinda sucks considering the massive impact he had for their success. When you think of the 1972 championship team that won 33 straight games, people usually mention Wilt Chamberlain and Jerry West. But the leading scorer of that squad was actually Gail Goodrich, as he put up 26 a game on 49% shooting. He was usually scoring in transition, and he also had a solid mid-range jumper. This 6'1" guard went on to make 5 All-Star teams and is in the Basketball Hall of Fame. He's definitely a candidate for the title of the most underappreciated Laker of all time. Ben Gordon. Most people don't know about this guy in depth, but I guarantee you that any longtime Chicago fan will. Gordon was a 6'3" shooting guard who was always looking to score. he was a 6th Man of the Year winner in his rookie season, as he was perfectly built to be a massive scoring spark off the bench. He was also one of the best three-point shooters of his era, as he shot over 40% from three-point range over the course of his career. He was also a tremendously clutch shooter, who provided some epic late-game heroics for his Bulls in the postseason. An ankle injury that resulted in surgery really took a toll on his explosiveness, and as a result, Gordon didn't have a very long NBA career, which may be why he's rarely thought of by basketball fans. Danny Granger. As a 6'9" small forward who could handle the ball, who could explode at the rim, and who could score from basically everywhere on the court, he was basically like a discount version of a prime Tracy McGrady. For a little while in Indiana, he looked like he was on his way to becoming a legitimate superstar. In 2009, at only the age of 25, he was an NBA All-Star and won the league's Most Improved Player award while averaging 26 points, 5 rebounds, and 3 assists on 45% shooting. The one thing he did better than guys like McGrady and Kobe was three-point shooting, as he was hitting a deadly 40% of his attempts during his peak, while being among the league leaders in three-pointers attempted. As in the case of many guys in this series, Granger's body betrayed him, as a plethora of injuries had him rapidly declining before he even reached the age of 30. And at only the age of 31, he had played his last game in the NBA. Hal Greer. When talking about the 60s era, many people act like Bill Russell had all the All-Stars, while Wilt Chamberlain had no one to help him whatsoever. And that isn't completely true, because he often had this guy, the 6'2" shooting guard Hal Greer. He's an NBA Hall of Famer who made 10 All-Star teams, 7 All-NBA teams, and was a massive contributor towards the 76ers championship in 1967. He didn't always have the tightest handle of the basketball, but what he had was a solid pull-up jumper and a strong layup package when he got to the rim. This shifty guard even got as high as 6th in the MVP rankings in 1964, where he averaged 23 points, 6 rebounds, and 5 assists. If anyone ever says that Wilt Chamberlain had no help, make sure to educate them about the Bulldog Hal Greer. Darrell Griffith. Nowadays, people will say that the 80s were filled with unathletic plumbers, but the truth is, they just don't know basketball history, because any knowledgeable fan wouldn't say that about guys like Darrell Griffith. This 6'4" two guard was literally nicknamed Dr. Duncanstein for his incredible play above the rim. He was the NBA's Rookie of the Year in 1981, and for about a 5-year stretch, he was one of Utah's top scorers leading up to the draft selections of John Stockton and Karl Malone. He had a strong layup package with impressive body control. Beyond that, he was a pretty solid shooter for his time, as he led all players in three-point efficiency in 1984. He was never an all-star, but he was a borderline star who was a heck of an athlete. Richie Guerin. This 6'4" shooting guard is a New York Knicks legend, who played in the NBA from 1957 to 1970. Despite starting his career during the NBA's infancy, he had some skills that were way ahead of his time, as he had a quality handle, a lightning-quick first step, and had a great change of pace ability. During his prime, this guy was a walking bucket, and in the 1961-62 season, he averaged nearly 30 points, 7 assists, and 6 rebounds, while hitting 44% of his shots. Simply put, he was one of the most explosive offensive players that you've never heard about. Like on December 11th, 1959, when he dropped 57 points, 12 rebounds, and 8 assists on 58% shooting. He's a Hall of Famer who made 6 All-Star teams, and his legacy is certainly worth preserving.
In a 1996 interview, Michael Jordan was asked who he saw as the next Michael Jordan, the guy he would pass the torch to when he does inevitably retire. Michael said 2 players, Grant Hill and Penny Hardaway. Penny was often compared more to Magic Johnson than Michael Jordan, since he was a large point guard standing at 6 foot 7 inches tall. Before Dwayne Wade and Kobe Bryant, Penny Hardaway was the feared wing player alongside of Shaquille O'Neal. He was drafted in 1993 with a 3rd overall pick by the Golden State Warriors, but the Warriors traded Penny and picks to the Magic for the rights to draft Chris Webber. The Magic had originally intended to draft Webber and pair him with Shaq, which is an interesting and rarely talked about what if. But after a second workout with Penny, they changed their mind and decided to make the trade. Upon Penny's first year in the league, he immediately made a significant impact, averaging 16 points, 6.6 assists, 5.4 rebounds, and 2.3 steals on 46.6% shooting. He started the year as a shooting guard, but was mentored at the point guard position by Scott Skiles, who was a wise and solid point guard in his own right, and is still the single-game record holder for assists in a game with 30. With his developing skills and Skiles' mentorship, it didn't take very long for Penny to take the next step to superstardom. In only his second year in the league, he was the starting point guard, and he helped lead his team to 57 wins while averaging 20.9 points, 7.2 assists, 4.4 rebounds, and 1.7 steals on an extremely point guard efficient 51.2% from the field. It's important to remember that the late 90s had some of the lowest scoring NBA seasons since the 1950s. So if Penny played in just about any other era, his numbers would have looked even better. They topped it off with a trip to the NBA Finals, where they were ultimately swept by the Houston Rockets. But that certainly wasn't Penny's fault. He showed up in the series big, averaging 25.5 points, 8 assists, and 4.8 rebounds on 50% shooting. At this point, as only a 23-year-old, Penny was recognized as a legitimate superstar and as one of the elite players in the league, despite the fact that he was still around 5 years short of his prime. Penny was the perfect example of a retro player who would average monster numbers if he played in today's game. He was a large point guard who could often exploit mismatches with smaller defenders on him. In his early 20s, he was a fantastic ball handler with remarkable court vision and passing abilities. He was a great scorer who was very efficient from the field, and you also had to respect him from three-point range. You also had to be careful with the ball around Penny, as he was usually among the league leaders in steals. Remember, we've covered all of this talent and numbers from Penny so far, and we've still only addressed his first 2 years in the NBA. His third year would be the best of his career, leading his Magic to a 60-22 record while putting up numbers of 21.7 points, 7.1 assists, and 4.3 rebounds on 51.3% shooting. They made it all the way to the Eastern Conference Finals this season, but the 72-10 Bulls were on their revenge tour and were way too much for the Magic to handle. Sadly, this would be Penny's last healthy season as a developing superstar. It also marked the offseason where Shaq left the Magic for the Los Angeles Lakers. In the 97-98 season, Penny dealt with a multitude of injuries and only played in 59 games that year. The season after that, he had a devastating left knee injury which required surgery and forced him to miss all but 19 games that year. From this point on, Penny's superstar promise was gone, and although he played 9 more years in the league, he was never an all-star again, and was at best a role player for the Suns, Knicks, and Heat. The truth is, we never saw this man's prime. He was barely 25 years old by the time the injury bug took over, but he could have been a perennial winner and one of the greatest all-around players to ever live if he had simply been more fortunate. Let me know in the comments section how good you think Penny would have been without the injuries.
Tim Hardaway. This guy had one of the filthiest handles in basketball history, as he had some tremendous skills and backed it up as one of the most aggressive trash talkers in the entire league. This 6-foot point guard was a dangerous two-way threat, as he could score in bunches while being one of the best facilitators in the entire league. The best years of his career were in Golden State and Miami, and in that time he made 5 All-Star teams and 5 All-NBA teams. At his individual best in 1992 as a member of the Run TMC Warriors, he averaged 23 points, 10 assists, 4 rebounds, and 2 steals on 46% shooting from the field, as he finished 8th overall in the MVP voting. He even got as high as 4th in the MVP voting in 1997 as a member of the Miami Heat. He also loved to shoot the 3-ball, as he was usually among the league leaders in attempts per game. He's definitely a tier below the greatest point guards in NBA history, but on any given night, he could be the best player on the court. Ron Harper. He's one of those unique players who's most famously remembered for a part of his career that was outside of his prime, which was obviously during his 3-championship stint as the Bulls' starting point guard. But before that, he was actually a solid two-guard, who was leaned upon heavily offensively. Standing at 6'6", he was a solid jump shooter, who could slash and finish above the rim. His best seasons individually were on the Clippers and Cavaliers, and arguably his best season was his rookie year in Cleveland, where he played all 82 games and averaged 23 points, 5 rebounds, 5 assists, and 2.5 steals on 45% shooting. John was known for several things throughout his legendary career. He was a leader, a workhorse with incredible stamina, and he was one of the most clutch performers the NBA has ever seen. Whenever the Celtics needed a big game or a big play, John was often the man who provided it for them. He was drafted out of Ohio State University in the 1962 NBA draft. When John was drafted by the Boston Celtics, he was known mainly as a defensive player from his college days. But now, he was playing with the very talented Boston Celtics. With Boston loaded with stars, very often the defense would sag off on John, daring him to shoot the ball. His legendary head coach, Red Auerbach, told him that he shouldn't let the defense disrespect him like that, and that Havlicek needed to be more aggressive offensively. This bit of advice completely changed his career, to say the least. Not only did he look to score more, but he became one of the best scorers the NBA had to offer, and currently has the 7th most shot attempts in NBA history. He was a 13-time All-Star with 11 All-NBA selections, and he was the 1974 Finals MVP. He was a scoring wing player with a smooth jump shot, and he was a tenacious and scrappy defender who often forced his opponent into turnovers, none more famous than in Game 7 of the Eastern Conference Finals between his Celtics and Wilt Chamberlain's 76ers. With a game and a trip to the NBA Finals on the line, Hal Greer was inbounding the ball. The Celtics were leading by 1 point when John Havlicek made one of the most famous defensive plays in NBA history. He anticipated the pass and stole the ball, sending the Celtics to the finals where they would go on to win one of his astonishing 8 NBA championships. People frequently talk about Michael Jordan's undefeated 6-0 NBA Finals record, but there are actually 3 players in league history who have an even greater Finals record than Jordan, and one of them is John Havlicek, who finished with an 8-0 record. He was the Finals MVP in 1974 with a stat line of 26.4 points, 7.7 rebounds, 4.7 assists, and 1.9 steals on 42.9% shooting. The thing is, yes, Havlicek was the Finals MVP in 1974, but that was one of the few championship seasons where the Finals MVP actually existed and was available to him. If the award had always existed throughout his career, he would definitely have multiple Finals MVPs to his name, with the 1968 Finals and the 1969 Finals being 2 of his standout performances. Bill Russell is obviously remembered as the leader and the iconic cornerstone of the Celtics dynasty, as he should be, but it is worth acknowledging that Russell had the luxury of leading upon his teammates offensively, while he focused more on what he was best at, defense and rebounding. One of those players he leaned upon heavily was Havlicek, who at one point led his loaded Celtics in scoring for 6 consecutive seasons. On top of all of this, he was also one of the elite wing defenders of league history with his 8 all-defense teams. But that stat only tells one portion of the story. In his first 11 seasons in the NBA, the league wasn't tracking any blocks or steals, which kept him from ranking high on the all-time lists. The Defensive Player of the Year award also didn't exist until years after he retired. So as impressive as his career resume is, in reality, it should be recognized as significantly better. He played 16 reliable seasons with the Celtics and never once played less than 70 games in a season. For his career, he averaged 20.8 points, 6.3 rebounds, and 4.8 assists per game. But during his prime season, he was averaging nearly a triple-double of 29 points, 9 rebounds, and over 7 assists, while playing a remarkable 45 minutes per game. Outside of Bill Russell, you could argue that no other player was more pivotal to the Celtics' success in the 60s and 70s than John Havlicek. He's still the Boston Celtics all-time leader in points and field goals made. He's second in assists and 5th in rebounds. He's ranked 4th all-time behind Kobe Bryant, Dirk Nowitzki, and Tim Duncan in points scored by a player who spent his entire career with one franchise. Havlicek was one of 10 players in NBA history to make at least 8 All-NBA teams and 8 All-Defensive teams. The other 9 are Tim Duncan, Kobe Bryant, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, Hakeem Olajuwon, Michael Jordan, David Robinson, Kevin Garnett, Gary Payton, and Chris Paul. That's some pretty legendary company. On top of all of this, John was known as a wonderful teammate and human being. In a statement released by the Celtics organization shortly after his passing, they said, "His defining traits as a player were his relentless hustle and wholehearted commitment to team over self. He was extraordinarily thoughtful and generous, both on a personal level and for those in need, as illustrated by his commitment to raising money for the Genesis Foundation for Children for over 3 decades through his fishing tournament. John was kind, considerate, humble, and gracious. He was a champion in every sense." John Hondo Havlicek will be remembered in NBA history as a terrific ambassador of the game and as the quintessential Boston Celtic. Connie Hawkins. This 6'8" small forward was simply a dynamic superstar. He started his career in the ABA and won the league MVP in his rookie season, as he efficiently averaged 27 points, 13 rebounds, and 5 assists, while leading the Pittsburgh Pipers to the ABA championship, in what was one of the most impressive rookie campaigns in sports history. In his second season, he was the MVP runner-up, as he averaged 30, 11, and 4. But what about his basketball skills specifically? While Hawkins was a fantastic mid-range shooter, and he was utterly dangerous around the rim, he was similar to Julius Erving and George Gervin in the way he glided through the air, had tremendous body control, and had a filthy finger roll. He was also extremely similar to Michael Jordan, from the standpoint that he had ridiculously huge hands, which he often used to throw defenders off with his one-handed ball fakes. In total, he made 6 All-Star teams, mostly for the Phoenix Suns, on his way to the Basketball Hall of Fame. Hersey Hawkins. This 6'3" two-guard was one of the best supporting stars throughout his career. He moved around quite a bit throughout his playing days, but his individual best was in his early years in Philadelphia, where he was an NBA All-Star in 1991, as he averaged 22, 4, and 4 on 47% shooting. He was also an elite three-point shooter, as he hit nearly 40% of his attempts throughout his career. Most famously, he played for the Seattle Supersonics in 1996, who made it all the way to the NBA Finals. He was a starter and a major scorer for that group, but for some reason, people always act like Gary Payton and Shawn Kemp were the only stars on that squad.
Ever since Michael Jordan shined in his NBA career, media and fans everywhere have been asking who would be the next Michael Jordan. Who would be the player who would rise above the rest of the league, take the game to new heights, and win championship after championship as the new face of the league? Eventually, Kobe Bryant became the man who took the title, and the comparisons were constant. But before the torch had been passed to Kobe, there was another player who held the torch and was referred to as the next Michael Jordan more often than anyone else. Grant Henry Hill, drafted in 1994 by the Detroit Pistons. He was a lengthy 6'8" small forward who had all the skills. He could handle the ball, he could rebound, he could facilitate with the best of them, and he was an efficient scorer, and a force when driving to the rim. He was so good that in a 1996 interview, he received Jordan's seal of approval. MJ was asked in that interview who he sees as the next Michael Jordan, the guy he would pass the torch to when he does inevitably retire. Michael said 2 players, Grant Hill and Penny Hardaway. In Hill's 1994-1995 rookie campaign, he had an immediate impact and his revolutionary talent was clearly on display. For the year, Hill averaged a solid 19.9 points, 6.4 rebounds, 5 assists, and 1.8 steals on 47.7% shooting. When you compare these numbers to the rookie numbers of LeBron James, you can see what kind of impression this man was making upon entering the league. In the 1995-96 season, which was only his second season, Grant Hill led the league in All-Star votes, gaining more votes than even Michael Jordan. This was MJ, the greatest player of all time, in the middle of an MVP year and in the middle of his Bulls' historic 72-10 season, and yet Hill still received the most All-Star votes that year. That should tell you the level of potential that we as fans recognized in Hill during the mid-90s. During that sophomore season, Hill averaged 20.2 points, 9.8 rebounds, 6.9 assists, and 1.3 steals per game. The following year, he improved those numbers, averaging 21.4 points, 9 rebounds, 7.3 assists, and 1.8 steals per game on 49.6% shooting, while also leading the league in triple-doubles. And again, this was only his third season in the league. It was clear to everyone that this man was on a trajectory to be one of the greatest players of all time. At the end of that 1996-97 season, Hill had finished third overall in the MVP voting, behind only Michael Jordan and Karl Malone. Hill was the first person since Larry Bird in the 80s to average over 20 points, over 9 rebounds, and over 7 assists in the season. That hadn't been done again until Russell Westbrook did it in the 2016-2017 season. As his career went on, Hill continued to dominate and lead his Pistons squad. Under his leadership and talent, the Pistons went from a terrible 20-win team to a 54-win team in just 3 seasons. By 1999, Hill was a respected force in the league and was carrying his Pistons. He had led his team in all 3 of these categories: points, rebounds, and assists in 3 seasons. In the 1999-2000 season, Grant was having the best year of his career, averaging 25.8 points, 6.6 rebounds, and 5.2 assists on 49% shooting. He was only 27 years old and just starting to reach the prime of his career. And unfortunately, that's when it all came crashing down for Grant Hill. With only 3 games left in the regular season, Hill brutally sprained his ankle, in an injury that would essentially ruin his days as an elite-level player. His first 6 years in the league was one of the greatest starts to a career the NBA had ever seen, but he would never be the same after the injury. To give you even more evidence on just how special he was, after those first 6 seasons of his career before his ankle injury, he had a total of 9,393 points, 3,417 rebounds, and 2,720 assists. Oscar Robertson, Larry Bird, and LeBron James are the only 3 players in league history to eclipse these numbers after their first 6 seasons in the league. In the next 6 years of his career after his first ankle injury, he would have ongoing issues with the ankle and even had to have surgery. In those years, Hill missed a whopping 357 games out of a possible 492 games. He just couldn't stay on the floor. It wasn't until he was 35 years old in his 07-08 season that he finally regained his health and found a role on the Phoenix Suns. He was a decent role player for them, consistently averaging around 12 points a game, but his days as a superstar player were then just a distant memory. Essentially, Hill had only his first 6 years in the league to display his healthy talent before his progression was cut short and his career was basically ruined due to his ankle problems. To help put that in perspective, here are a few of the greatest players ever and the ramifications on their careers if they had a career-ruining ankle injury after their first 6 seasons. Kobe Bryant would have only 3 championships, no MVPs, and no 81-point game. LeBron James would have 0 championships and only 1 MVP award. And Michael Jordan would have 0 championships and only 1 MVP award. Hopefully this gives you a sense of just how much greatness we potentially lost from Hill. Due to this, he remains one of the greatest what-ifs in all of NBA history.
Craig Hodges. He's one of the great yet forgotten role-playing teammates of Michael Jordan's career, as Hodges was a member of the Bulls between 1988 and 1992. To put it simply, Hodges was a spot-up shooting assassin and was one of the greatest three-point shooters in NBA history. He's tied with Larry Bird for the most three-point contests won with a total of 3, and he still holds the record for the most consecutive shots made in the history of that contest, as he made 19 straight in 1991. And the closest to that feat is Steph Curry in 2015 with a streak of just 13. During the actual games, Hodges was a 40% three-point shooter and led the league in three-point efficiency twice, getting as high as a whopping 49.1% in 1988. He'd certainly be a household name if he played in this modern NBA. Allan Houston. Longtime Knicks fans remember this guy quite well. Houston was a 6'6" shooting guard who could light up the scoreboard in a short amount of time. In his prime for the Knicks, he was one of the most efficient shooting guards in the entire league, both from the free throw line and from three-point range. He was also a volume three-point shooter, who hit over 40% of his attempts throughout his career. He was the team's top overall scorer during their NBA Finals run in 1999, and he made 2 All-Star teams as a guy who was averaging around 20 points per game. And that was during some of the lowest scoring seasons in NBA history. Dan Issel. He was a 6'9" center/power forward, who was very aggressive about getting to the rim. But when he happened to settle on the perimeter, he was one of the best jump shooters the league had to offer. He played in both the ABA and the NBA, and especially in his early years, he was a monster statistically. He led the ABA in scoring in his rookie season in 1971, as he averaged 30 points, 13 rebounds, and 2 assists on 48% shooting. After his move to the NBA, he went on to be a star player for the Denver Nuggets. He has quite the stacked resume, as he was a 7-time All-Star, the Rookie of the Year winner, the 1975 ABA champion, won the All-Star Game MVP in 1972, has a scoring title, and is a Basketball Hall of Famer.
To various degrees, we all know about the greatness of Phil Jackson from a coaching and leadership standpoint, as he's not only arguably the greatest coach in NBA history, but he's even in the conversation of the greatest coaches in sports history. We also know about his stint as a general manager with the New York Knicks, which was disappointing to say the least, and is all the proof you need that a high basketball IQ doesn't mean you'll excel at every role within an organization. But then there was Phil Jackson as a player, which is the least documented and least discussed aspect of his basketball career, which then begs the question, just how good of a basketball player was Phil Jackson really? Today, I'll do my best to answer that, and we'll start as we always do, by taking it back to the beginning of his career. Phil Jackson was selected with the 17th overall pick by the New York Knicks in the 1967 NBA Draft. He was a lengthy 6'8" power forward who was joining a losing Knicks squad who appeared as if they were beginning to turn the corner. I couldn't find an exact measurement of Phil Jackson's wingspan, but it's definitely impressive, as his extremely long arms and harassing tendencies made him difficult defensively. With that being said, he wasn't much of an offensive threat, especially earlier on in his career. In his rookie season as a 22-year-old, he played in only 14.6 minutes per game, and he averaged about 6 points and 4.5 rebounds on only 40% shooting, and a well below average 59% from the free throw line. Despite not being a scoring threat, he still managed to make the NBA's all-rookie team thanks to his energetic defense off the bench. In The Last Dance, there was a brief comparison of Phil Jackson's game to Dennis Rodman's, and it's really quite incredible how similar he actually was to Rodman. Definitely not in terms of production, but more so in terms of their play styles, as he appeared to be somewhat awkward on the court, and he wasn't a great offensive player, but he always played with hustle and heart, and had a strong motor that kept him going at 100%, regardless of how many minutes he played. Phil was also extremely competitive, a trait he said he got from his mother, who was the team captain of her high school basketball team, and who Phil said was probably the most competitive person he's ever known, which is a statement that really blows your mind even if you think about it for just a few seconds. His game would continue to develop over time, but the progress was somewhat hindered by an ongoing issue throughout his playing career, and even in his life in general. He played in only 47 games in his sophomore season due to his chronic back issues. The pain and issues in his back were so severe that it caused him to also miss the entirety of his third season. This could have been the end of his career, but fortunately, New York held on to him, and Jackson stuck with it. Despite Phil missing the 1970 season, New York still went on to win 60 games and eventually the NBA championship. Since Phil was still technically on the roster, he was granted an NBA championship ring, the first of many that he would accumulate throughout his basketball career. By the time he returned to the court for the Knicks in the 1970-71 season, New York was ready to continue their dominant play, with stars like Walt Frazier and Willis Reed. Although they would make several deep postseason runs, his year wouldn't come until the 1972-73 season, where Jackson's Knicks won 57 games. This was far from Jackson's best season of his career, but he had made significant improvements to several aspects of his game, including his mid-range shooting. In his 17.4 minutes per game, he averaged 8.1 points and 4.3 rebounds on 44.3% shooting and a tremendously improved 79% from the free throw line. He had now become a key contributor, mostly defensively, and his Knicks went on to win the 1973 NBA championship in 5 games over the Los Angeles Lakers.
Although this was the highlight of his career from a team standpoint, his best season as an individual would come 2 years later, as Phil had found his way into the starting lineup, averaging nearly 30 minutes per game and putting up 10.8 points, 7.7 rebounds, and 1.1 steals on 45.5% shooting, while also continuing his reliable defense. He certainly wasn't lacking any tenacity that season, as his aggressive defense also resulted in him leading the league in personal fouls that year. He would begin his decline from that point as he advanced into his 30s, finishing out his final 2 seasons with the New Jersey Nets. At the end of the day, Phil Jackson would not have made the Hall of Fame simply off of his playing career, but he was an impact player on one of the great teams of NBA history, and it comes as no surprise that one of the greatest coaches ever played basketball the way coaches always preach it: defense leading to offense, team first, and with hustle and heart throughout the entirety of the contest. Obviously, considering my age, everything I shared in this video is based off of lots of research and all the footage I could witness of Phil Jackson's game. So with that being said, if you're someone who witnessed him play, I care tremendously to hear your perspective on just how good Phil Jackson was as a basketball player. As for the rest of you, let me know in the comment section if you think Phil Jackson is the greatest coach in NBA history.
Shawn Travis Kemp. I talked about this before in my Gary Payton video, but sometimes you'll get an NBA legend whose legacy and impact gets somewhat lost in the game's history for one reason or another. In the cases of Kemp and Payton, it's due to the fact that they spent the majority of their Hall of Fame career for a city that literally no longer has an NBA team. Who is there to hang their jerseys, or to give them standing ovations and reminisce about years past? Unfortunately, no one. So their connection to today's NBA fan has become even more hazy. But with this video, hopefully we can remind the basketball community about the impact, uniqueness, and the talent of the great Shawn Kemp. Shawn was drafted with the 17th overall pick in the 1989 NBA draft by the Seattle Supersonics. The athletic 6'10" power forward didn't have very high expectations upon entering the league, since he was only 19 years old and was the NBA's youngest player at the time. He started in just one game of his rookie season and had very modest contributions of 6.5 points and 4.3 rebounds on 48% shooting. The team finished with only a .500 record and missed the playoffs, but it would be in his second season where he would really begin to break out, and a big reason for that was the arrival of their new rookie point guard, Gary Payton. Kemp and Payton had playstyles that were basically tailor-made for one another, as Gary was a quick point guard who consistently wanted to push the tempo for the Sonics, and Kemp, being a young and athletic slasher, was more than happy to oblige. The nickname Lob City came from the LA Clippers of the early 2010s, but if there's a team who deserved that nickname before them, it was certainly the Supersonics of the 1990s, as the Payton and Kemp connection was one of the most frequent and entertaining highlights during that era. With his new facilitator helping him develop, Kemp had very improved sophomore numbers of 15 points, 8.4 rebounds, and 1.5 blocks on 50.8% shooting in just 30 minutes per game. Over the next several years, his game would continue to develop as he slowly improved his footwork and post moves to make him an even better scorer and rebounder. But obviously, what continued to make him stand out was his incredible play above the rim. I recently saw someone say in a comment that Kemp put the power in power forward. And honestly, I couldn't put it any better myself. Everything this guy did on the court looked violent, disrespectful, and authoritative in a good way. From the way he dribbled the basketball to the way he attacked the basket, how he blocked shots, how he dunked the ball, how he embarrassed his opponents, and even straight up taunted them at times. In many ways, he became the symbol of what made Seattle Supersonics basketball special, as his game was loud, energetic, and exciting, just like their audience was in those days. Many young basketball fans today often talk about how they think modern-day players are bigger, stronger, and more athletic than athletes of years past. But apparently, they forgot about the 6'10" Shawn Kemp. From 1993 to 1997, Kemp was selected as an All-Star in all 5 of those years with the Sonics, and in that time, he averaged 18.6 points, 10.7 rebounds, 1.5 steals, and 1.6 blocks on 53% shooting. They made it to the playoffs in each of those seasons and came close to making it to the finals in 1993. But the Sonics wouldn't break through until the 95-96 season, where they won 64 games and were meeting the 72-10 Chicago Bulls in the championship series. I won't go into a ton of details about
about this series because most of you already know the details. Bulls win the first 3 games, Sonics charge back and win 2, and then the Bulls and Jordan win the iconic Game 6 on Father's Day. But what many people do forget is how special Kemp was in this series, as he averaged 23.3 points, 10 rebounds, 1.3 steals, and 2 blocks on 55% shooting. Pulling off these numbers in this hard-fought, low-scoring series was impressive enough for him to finish as a very close second place in the finals MVP voting. If he had won the award over Jordan, that would have made him only the second player in NBA history to win the finals MVP on the losing team. This was essentially the peak of Kemp's career, because after contract disputes with the Sonics organization and another failed attempt at a deep postseason run, the Sonics traded Kemp to the Cavaliers in the summer of 1997. It was at this time that narratives started to pop up about Kemp's work ethic, because he was noticeably gaining lots of weight with the Cavaliers. Although his 3 seasons with Cleveland were certainly statistically productive, his game had clearly changed, as most of his explosiveness and athleticism from his Seattle days were now gone. After his issues with drugs and drinking became apparent, he wasn't very impactful, and was only in the league for a few more years, playing for the Trailblazers and Magic. By only the age of 33, the once fierce Shawn Kemp had played his final game in his NBA career. So now that we've covered most of his career, let's revisit the question of just how good was Shawn Kemp really? Well, he made 6 All-Star teams and 3 All-NBA teams. He's without question one of the greatest dunkers and alley-oop finishers of all time. And he was a decent defensive player, but never won any awards on that end of the court. He was certainly dangerous anywhere around the painted area and in the fast break, but he was never a consistent threat as a shooter for anything beyond mid-range. He didn't have much longevity to his career, but when he was at his best, he was easily one of the most intimidating and explosive big men the game has ever seen.
On this channel, we talk a lot about all-time great scorers, underrated players, and thought-provoking what-if stories, and this guy is all 3 of those things. Bernard King is one of the great players of the 1980s, but unfortunately, unless your name is Magic Johnson or Larry Bird, you don't get the credit you deserve for your contribution to that era. King also doesn't have the most established legacy with any one specific franchise, because he actually moved around a lot. He played for 6 different teams during his career. Players this great usually aren't journeymen, but that's what can happen when your career is riddled with injuries and off-the-court issues, as Bernard King's was. More on that later. But to really get a sense of how good this man was, let's take it back to the beginning of his career. King was drafted 7th overall in the 1977 NBA draft by the New Jersey Nets. He was a strong 6'7" small forward who was expected to deliver offensively, and that's exactly what he did. In his rookie campaign, as only a 21-year-old, he averaged 24.2 points, 9.5 rebounds, and 2.4 assists on 47.9% shooting. This was at a time where there was no three-point shot, not that he really cared much for it. When it came to scoring abilities, King was known for 2 things: his skills in the mid-range game and the fact that he was a monster in transition, who's since even drawn comparisons to LeBron James and Charles Barkley. But alcohol abuse was something that King was dealing with throughout the early years of his career. He also had issues with cocaine and just smart decision-making in general. Many believe that this is why New Jersey opted to trade him to the Utah Jazz only 2 years after solid production. It looked like New Jersey had made the right call, as he had a massive drop-off in production, averaging only 9 points a game in only 19 games played with the Jazz. This was just the beginning of his rollercoaster career of success and shortcomings. Instead of finishing the rest of the season with the Jazz, he instead spent that year in rehab for his alcohol addiction. One of the less talked about what-ifs of NBA history is what if King didn't have so many damn problems? He had all of the talent and the skills that a small forward could want in the early 80s, but he was also constantly dealing with different kinds of issues that would set him back from reaching his full potential. The Jazz were ready to move on and traded him to the Golden State Warriors. It was there in the Bay Area that his career would have a resurgence. Over the next 2 seasons with the Warriors, he averaged 22.5 points, 6.4 rebounds, and 3.6 assists on an absurdly efficient 57.7% from the field. Although they got close, the Warriors didn't make the playoffs those 2 seasons, resulting in the Warriors trading King to the New York Knicks for Michael Ray Richardson, who was a solid player in his own right. It was in New York where he would play his best basketball and truly build a legacy for himself. During that time, he went from simply a quality scorer to arguably the best in the league over the next few years. He also had some pretty iconic performances over that stretch, including back-to-back 50-point games against the Spurs and Mavericks in 1984. The craziest part is he made 40 of his 58 shots over those two games, which is a ridiculous 69% from the field. This is a testament to him as a player. Although he could always erupt for big scoring outings, he made sure he always did it efficiently. In the first round of the 1984 playoffs, he had one of the greatest playoff series in NBA history. His Knicks were taking on a favored and talented Detroit Pistons team who were led by Kelly Tripucka, Isaiah Thomas, and Bill Laimbeer. And despite all of that, Bernard King still absolutely dismantled the Pistons as he averaged 42.6 points and 8 rebounds on 60% shooting for that series. He torched the Pistons, scoring 40 points in 4 out of the 5 games. Despite the fact that he was tearing it up in the second round of the playoffs as well, his Knicks lost to the eventual champion Boston Celtics in 7 games. Honestly, it's pretty shocking that King was able to keep the series that close, considering Boston was a significantly more talented team overall. The following season, which was the 1984-85 season, was the best of his career, as he led the league in scoring, averaging 32.9 points, 5.8 rebounds, and 3.7 assists on 53% shooting. His best performance that year came on Christmas Day, where he dropped 60 points on 63% shooting on his former team, the New Jersey Nets. His 60 points is still an NBA record for the most points ever scored on Christmas Day, which is pretty remarkable considering how Christmas games throughout history have always involved the league's best teams and the league's best players. And yet King's performance still sits on the mountaintop. Unfortunately, it was only shortly after King started making offensive history that it all came to a crashing halt. He was only 28 years old, right in the prime of his career, when he suffered a terrible and career-altering injury as he tore his ACL and broke his right leg. This injury was so brutal that he missed the second half of the 1985 season, missed all of the 1986 season, and played in only the final 6 games of the 1987 season. With King now entering into his 30s and still trying to rebound from his injuries, New York was ready to move on and release their former superstar player. He signed with the Washington Bullets in 1987, and despite the fact that he was joining an underperforming franchise with no hope of title contention, he still personally had a lot to prove. King then appeared to be an alien over the next several years as he did something that no regular basketball players do, which is improving as he got later into his 30s. By the 1990-91 season, he was an all-star once again, even at the age of 34, as he averaged 28.4 points, 5 rebounds, and 4.6 assists on 47% shooting. Sadly, every time King seemed to be reaching his peak performance level, his body had to step in and ruin things, which happened again as knee problems caused him to miss the entire following season. He returned to the New Jersey Nets for the 1992-93 season, but by that point, he was 36 years old and just a shell of himself, as he averaged only 7 points per game for 32 games played that year before his knee problems eventually shut him down for good. Let me know in the comments section how much you think a prime Bernard King would average if he played on the Knicks in today's NBA. Thanks.
There have been many underrated and underappreciated players throughout the rich history of the NBA, and I'm certainly not going to claim that this player is the most underrated of them all. But at the very least, he's in the picture. His name is Lafayette Lever, most commonly referred to as Fat Lever. Lever played as a point guard / shooting guard between 1982 and 1994. As a 6'3" weapon, Lever spent the prime of his career with the Denver Nuggets, and he left a lasting impression on the organization. The Nuggets of the 1980s were known for their blistering pace, and for their insanely productive offense. Lever was the one who was primarily pushing the tempo for that Denver group, and under his orchestration, the Nuggets were the #1 ranked offense in terms of points scored, in both 1985 and in 1988. Being a top-scoring team in the league is impressive, but regularly averaging more points than the Showtime Lakers is a whole nother level of impressive. Now, Lever did a multitude of things well. He was a solid finisher around the rim. He was a fantastic shooter between 15 to 20 feet. He was an elite passer with terrific vision, and he was one of the greatest rebounding guards in the history of the league, especially for a guy who was just standing at 6'3" tall. All of this translated to him being a triple-double machine. He had a total of 43 triple-doubles throughout the course of his career, including a whopping total of 16 in the 86-87 season. That year, he averaged roughly 19 points, 9 rebounds, 8 assists, and 2.5 steals on 47% shooting from the field. That season, he finished 9th in the MVP voting and 8th in the Defensive Player of the Year voting. The following year, he would finish 9th again in the MVP voting and 5th in the DPOY voting. Famously, that Nuggets team was known as one of the best offenses, yet worst defenses in the entire league. But that wasn't Lever's fault, as he regularly brought his best effort on that end of the court. He finished in the top 8 spots of the DPOY voting 3 times in his career. He made 2 All-Star teams in a Western Conference loaded with fantastic guards. Alongside of his co-star Alex English, Denver was a regular contender in the Western Conference playoffs, making it as far to the West Finals in 1985, before being eliminated by the Lakers with Magic, Kareem, and Worthy. Due to his knee injuries, he didn't have a very long NBA career, as he had played his final game in the league at the young age of 33. If he had had a healthy and standard-length NBA career, then he certainly would have been very high on many of the all-time lists. Now don't get me wrong, he's not in the top tier of the all-time great point guards, but he's certainly in the top tier of the most underappreciated. In my opinion, he's one of the greatest players in league history to never be inducted to the Basketball Hall of Fame. In a way, he was like a more controlled yet less explosive version of Russell Westbrook in the 1980s. And I can only imagine the kind of numbers he would have put up in today's game, where his skill set would thrive tremendously.
Thanks. Moses Eugene Malone, also known as the chairman of the boards, and for good reason. Moses was a dominant force offensively and an all-time great rebounder. Moses was so much better than many NBA fans realize, and there's a number of reasons for this that go beyond simply his production. If I had to pick the biggest reason, I would say it's his legacy's identity crisis. Throughout his career, Moses played for 9 different teams, which is extremely rare even for a role player. But for an all-time great player, it's almost completely unheard of. Just look at the amount of different jerseys and numbers that this guy wore. The thing is, when a player isn't associated with a specific franchise, it affects his legacy and means that he isn't often remembered as fondly because he can't be claimed by one fan base as their own. Regardless of the reason, Moses is still criminally underrated. But just how great was he exactly? And where does he rank among the greatest centers of all time? To answer that, let's take it back to the beginning of his career. The 6'10 Moses was drafted in the 3rd round of the 1974 ABA draft by the Utah Stars. He was selected relatively late and straight out of high school, which wasn't a very common occurrence. In fact, at the time, the New York Times even called him the first high schooler to go straight to the pros in modern basketball history. He immediately proved he was more than ready. As only a 19-year-old in his rookie season in the ABA, Moses averaged 18.8 points, 14.6 rebounds, and 1.5 blocks on 57% shooting. This was good enough to make him an ABA All-Star in only his first year. The Stars eventually lost in the semifinals to the Denver Nuggets in 6 games. Unfortunately, Moses would not be enough to save the Stars franchise from their massive debt. The Stars organization folded, and as a result, they sold Malone to the Spirits of St. Louis. But he wouldn't get very comfortable there either. After only playing half of his second season in the league, the ABA and NBA merged before the beginning of his 3rd season as a pro. The Spirits were not among the teams selected to join the NBA, meaning Malone would once again be available in a draft. This time, it was the NBA-ABA merger draft, where he was selected by the New Orleans Jazz, before he was swapped to the Portland Trail Blazers for a regular draft pick, before the Blazers then experienced salary concerns and then traded him to the Buffalo Braves. I'm honestly starting to feel sorry for Moses just writing this script. Malone's 3rd season finally began with the Braves, but they were only playing him about 3 minutes a game, which had the young Malone extremely frustrated. As a result, after only 2 games with the Braves, they traded him to the Houston Rockets for 2 future first-round picks. Moses was barely into his 3rd season as a pro, and he had already been claimed by 6 different teams. The good news is that Malone would finally find a somewhat long-term home with the Rockets, and the frustrated and determined 21-year-old was ready to make all of the doubters look stupid, and he would do just that.
He played 80 games for the Rockets at about 31 minutes a game, and he averaged 13.5 points, 13.4 rebounds, and 2.5 blocks on 48% shooting. They eventually lost in the conference finals, but this was just a taste of what the Rockets and Moses were capable of. The following season, he averaged 19.4 points, 15 rebounds, and 1.3 blocks on 50% shooting. The only problem was that this year was cut short to just 59 games played when he got a stress fracture in his right foot, and his year was done. But when he would return healthy the following season, the prime of his monstrous career would begin. 1979 to 1982 was his best 4 years with Houston, and in that stretch, he averaged 27.4 points, 15.4 rebounds, and 1.5 blocks on 52% shooting. He also won the league MVP award in 2 of those seasons. This includes a performance against the New Orleans Jazz where he pulled down 37 rebounds in a single game. In the 1981-82 season, he put up 31.1 points and 14.7 rebounds in what was arguably the best year of his career. Let me put those numbers in perspective. No one in all of the years since has matched those 2 averages in a single season. Not Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, not Shaquille O'Neal, not Hakeem, or Giannis. No one. Statistically, he stood out far beyond his peers. From 1979 to 1985, he won 6 rebounding titles in 7 years, including 5 straight. His 6 rebounding titles is the 3rd most in NBA history, behind only Dennis Rodman and Wilt Chamberlain. And his streak of 5 years is the 2nd longest streak ever, behind only Rodman. The insane rebounding numbers he put up were not a product of his era either. In the modern NBA, teams are averaging around 45 rebounds a game. In Wilt Chamberlain's era, teams were averaging anywhere from 53 to 73 rebounds a game. And in Moses Malone's era, teams were averaging around 43 rebounds a game. Malone's era put him at a rebounding disadvantage, yet despite playing in the era with the fewest available rebounds in NBA history, Moses still put up video game numbers. With all of this being said, when it came to elite teams, the Rockets were playing in one of the most top-heavy eras in basketball history. The closest they came to winning the championship with Moses leading the way was in the 1981 season, but they lost in the NBA Finals in 6 games to the Larry Bird-led Celtics. If Moses was going to win an NBA championship in that era, he was going to need an even more talented supporting cast. Enter the summer of 1982 free agency. After much negotiating, Moses Malone was heading east to the talented and powerful Philadelphia 76ers. Waiting for him there was the still lethal man known as Dr. J, Julius Erving. With players like Moses, the Doctor, Maurice Cheeks, Andrew Toney, and Bobby Jones, the 76ers were ready to take the NBA by storm, and that's exactly what they did. They steamrolled the league, finishing with a 65-17 record, and although many contributed, Moses was clearly the best player throughout, putting up averages of 24.5 points, 15.3 rebounds, and 2 blocks on 50.1% shooting. His year-long performance earned him his 3rd MVP award and his 2nd straight. Moses is still the only player in NBA history to win back-to-back MVP awards on 2 separate teams. Their dominance continued into the playoffs as they went on an 11-1 run throughout the postseason, including a 4-game sweep of Kareem and Magic's Lakers in the NBA Finals. In those finals, Moses absolutely destroyed Kareem and the Lakers, putting up 25.8 points, 18 rebounds, 1.5 steals, and 1.5 blocks on 50.7% shooting, and he was rewarded the Finals MVP. When we think of the era of 1980s basketball, we understandably think of Magic's Lakers and Bird's Celtics. But it's also important for us to remember that sandwiched in those years is one of the greatest teams of all time, the 1983 Philadelphia 76ers. Malone played for many years after this and was certainly productive, but this was without question the highlight of his career. He finished out his long-lasting career also playing for Washington, Atlanta, Milwaukee, and a return to Philly and San Antonio. In his career, he had 11 straight seasons where he averaged at least 20 points and 10 rebounds. He was a 13-time All-Star, made 8 All-NBA teams and 2 All-Defense teams. His game was made up of incredible stamina, and he played with hustle, heart, and strength. So just how great was Moses Malone really? Well, I'll put it this way. Many people compare the greatest centers of all time, and usually the names that people bring up are guys like Wilt Chamberlain, Bill Russell, Shaquille O'Neal, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, and Hakeem Olajuwon. I am telling you with complete conviction that Moses Malone belongs in that group.
Peter Press Maravich, also known as Pistol Pete. It's no secret that Maravich was a transcendent and quality basketball player, but just how good was he exactly? Well, let's do this like we do with all other players in this series and take it back to the beginning of their career. Long before the Pistol had played a professional basketball game, Pete's father, Press, was hell-bent on making his son Pete into an NBA talent. As a result, hard work and basketball obsession was very present in Pete's life from a very early age. It was evident as it led Pete to have arguably the greatest college basketball career of all time, as he averaged an absurd 44.2 points per game over his 3 years in Division I competition. Because of this, Pistol Pete was obviously a hot commodity heading into his NBA career. The 6'5" shooting guard was drafted 3rd overall in the 1970 draft by the Atlanta Hawks. You would think that a player with that kind of collegiate career would then be greeted with optimism from his new NBA teammates, but that actually wasn't the case. You see, Pete had a very flashy style of basketball that was frowned upon at the time that he was entering the NBA. All of his fast breaks, no-look passes, behind-the-back passes, and circus shots weren't embraced by many players and many teams within the league, and the Hawks players were no exception. The other star players on the Hawks were their point guard Lou Hudson and their center Walt Bellamy, who both had a very conservative style of play. Even with some early-on chemistry issues, Maravich still found ways to be productive and excellent in his rookie campaign, as he averaged 23.2 points, 4.4 assists, and 3.7 rebounds on 45.8% shooting. It was an impressive debut that ultimately resulted in a first-round exit at the hands of the New York Knicks. As the years went on, Maravich's skills and production continued to improve. He was a genius on the fast break, he was a passing wizard, he was likely the greatest ball handler at the time, and he was an absolute scoring machine as he could get a bucket in a multitude of ways. He was great at finishing in the paint, he had a reliable mid-range game, and he even had the range to score from 20 feet and beyond. During these years, the three-point line wasn't invented yet, but Maravich was without question one of the players who could have greatly benefited from the three-point shot. By his 3rd year, he had broke out as an elite superstar in the NBA, as he was 5th in scoring and 6th in assists, as he averaged 26.1 points, 6.9 assists, and 4.4 rebounds on 44% shooting. In Maravich's first 4 years with the Hawks, he had established himself as a premier player, but the team still wasn't clicking enough to be among the elite teams of the NBA, and the Hawks were ready to make some changes. Enter the New Orleans Jazz. The Jazz were a 1974 expansion team. They needed someone to help bring attention and excitement to their new franchise, so they traded 2 players and 4 draft picks to the Hawks to acquire Maravich. It comes as no surprise that the new expansion New Orleans Jazz offered little help to Maravich, and despite his fantastic numbers, they never made the playoffs during those years. The lack of talented support didn't stop Maravich from putting on a strong display with the Jazz right as he was entering the prime of his career. In Pete's 3rd year with the Jazz, he had the best season of his career as he led the league in scoring for the 76-77 season at 31.1 points per game. What makes this even more impressive is that this was the first season after the NBA and ABA merger, meaning the competition was stronger and the league was jam-packed with fantastic scorers that year. Despite competitors like Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, Billy Knight, David Thompson, George Gervin, Bob McAdoo, Rick Barry, Bob Lanier, and Julius Erving, Pete Maravich was still by far the leading scorer that season, with nearly a 5-point lead in his average ahead of the nearest scorer. The highlight of that year was when the Pistol dropped 68 points on the New York Knicks. At the time, it was the most points ever scored by a guard in NBA history. Remember, this was at a time when there was no three-point line, and this guard dropped 68 points. With the distance he had on many of his shots, he easily would have scored into the 70s if he had a three-point line. This also makes you wonder how many points he would have averaged that season and in his career if many of his baskets were worth 3 points instead of 2 points. Maravich was a force, but unfortunately, due to some consistent knee issues, Pete's career was cut very short. With his scoring and assists, he should be much higher on the all-time list, but he only played 658 games throughout his career. That's essentially only 8 full seasons of basketball, yet despite that, he still had 5 All-Star appearances and made 4 All-NBA teams. His final season was at just 32 years old. It was the 1979-1980 season, which was the NBA's first ever season with a three-point shot. He was well past his prime at this point, and the knee issues were laboring him throughout the year and caused him to miss many games. Despite the sample size, he still made 10 of his 15 three-point attempts, which is a remarkable 66%. One can only wonder what his career percentage would have been if the three-point shot had always been available to him. He played his final games coming off the bench as an offensive spark for the Boston Celtics, who were led by Larry Bird in his rookie campaign. For the Pistols' career, he averaged 24.2 points, 5.4 assists, 4.2 rebounds, and 1.4 steals on 44% shooting. This man's career was quite short, but it still left quite an impression on many other greats. All-time legend Elgin Baylor said this of Maravich: "Oscar Robertson was the best guard I've ever played against. Jerry West was the best I've ever played with. Pete was the best I've ever seen." Years after his retirement, Maravich did lots of soul-searching before giving his life to Christ and becoming a Christian. Just a few years before his death, Maravich said, "I want to be remembered as a Christian, a person that serves Jesus to the utmost, not as a basketball player." And that brings us to January 5th, 1988, in Pasadena, California. At Pete's church, he was playing a pickup game with his friends when he collapsed and died due to a heart defect. He was only 40 years old, and he was playing the game he loved. So just how good was Pete Maravich really? Well, he was one of the hardest workers ever, one of the greatest passers, one of the greatest ball handlers, and one of the greatest scorers, which altogether makes him one of the greatest guards of NBA history.
Throughout the decades, there have been several great two-way players who left their lasting imprint on the league. Guys like Akeem Olajuwon, Scottie Pippen, Gary Payton, and even more recent stars like Kawhi Leonard and Paul George. But one of the all-time great two-way players who seems to fly under the radar everywhere other than on my channel is the Milwaukee Bucks legend Sidney Moncrief. This 6'4" point guard / shooting guard was an absolute problem in the 1980s. For some reason, he's rarely mentioned when discussing the all-time great two-way players. But back in his era, everyone knew that he was one of the most dreaded one-on-one matchups in the entire league, and on both ends of the court. So in order for us to understand what kind of player he was, let's start, as we always do, by taking it back to the beginning of his career. Moncrief was drafted by the Milwaukee Bucks with the 5th overall pick in the 1979 draft, out of the University of Arkansas. Obviously, Magic Johnson took all of the headlines as the first pick in that historic draft. But the next best player to come out of the class of '79 was in fact Moncrief. He had a somewhat slow start to his career, and in his rookie season, he averaged just 8 points in 20 minutes of action, on a Bucks team that was still finding its groove. He didn't truly arrive until his 3rd season in the league, which was his first year as an NBA All-Star. As the team's leader in points, assists, and rebounds, he led his Bucks to a 55-27 record, good enough for the 2nd seed in the Eastern Conference. As a solid pickpocket and a smothering on-ball defender, there's a good chance that he would have won the Defensive Player of the Year award that season if the award had actually existed at that point in history. But his time would soon come after. The Defensive Player of the Year award was introduced to the NBA in the 1982-83 season, and Moncrief went on to win the award in its first 2 seasons of existence, in 1983 and 1984. To this very day, he's the only guard in NBA history to win the award multiple times. Not only was he a lockdown defender, but his skills continue to improve on the offensive end. As an athletically gifted slasher, he had his best season offensively in 1983, where he averaged over 22 points per game on 52.4% shooting. Typically, 6'4" guards struggle to be a high scorer while averaging north of 50% from the field. Not only did Moncrief do that in 1983, but he actually shot better than 50% from the field over the course of his career. From 1982 to 1986, he was an All-Star in 5 straight seasons. But beyond the fact that his individual abilities were shining, he was also leading his team to be a consistent contender in the Eastern Conference. For some reason, when people talk about the 1980s Eastern Conference, people seem to only think of the Celtics, the Pistons, the Bulls, and the 76ers. But the thing is, the Bucks were always in that mix as well. From 1981 to 1987, Moncrief led his Bucks to have at least 50 wins in 7 straight seasons, including trips to the Eastern Conference Finals in 1983, 1984, and 1986. One shocking accomplishment was when his Bucks swept Larry Bird and the Boston Celtics out of the 1983 semifinals, 4-0. Larry Bird has since went on to describe that series as the most embarrassing moment of his life. In those semifinals, Moncrief led all players in scoring while leading his team in assists and steals. Eliminating Bird and the Celtics in the midst of their dynasty days was no easy task. But one of the greatest achievements of his career is what he accomplished in the 1985 NBA playoffs. When people think of Michael Jordan's playoff exits before Scottie Pippen developed into a co-star, they usually think of their losses at the hands of the Celtics and Pistons. But the thing is, neither of those teams were actually the first team to eliminate Michael Jordan from the playoffs. That was Sidney Moncrief and his Milwaukee Bucks. With the help of his co-star, Terry Cummings, the Bucks dominated the Bulls, winning the series in 4 games, 3-1. In that historic series, the 2-time Defensive Player of the Year winner, Sidney Moncrief, contained Michael Jordan to only 43.6% shooting over the course of the series. And then, when it came to the offensive end, Sidney averaged 26.5 points, nearly 5 rebounds, and nearly 5 assists, on far greater than 50-40-90 percentages over the course of the series. At the end of the day, I can't say enough positive things about this incredibly overlooked guard. Being the only guard to win back-to-back DPOYs is a special achievement in and of itself. But doing it in an era where he had to consistently guard guys like Larry Bird, Michael Jordan, Dominique Wilkins, and Clyde Drexler is just overwhelmingly impressive. Although he was one of the best players in the league during his prime, and although he's one of the greatest two-way players of all time, unfortunately, he didn't have very great longevity due to his degenerative knee issues and significant heel issues that drastically limited his productivity as he entered his late 20s. The drop-off was dramatic, and by the age of 29, he was only a shell of what he once was. At the age of 31, he retired from the NBA and spent an entire year away from professional basketball. When he was 33 years old, he came back to the NBA as a member of the Atlanta Hawks, but he only had very minor contributions throughout the course of the regular season. He did manage to have one amazing flashback when he dropped 23 points in just 22 minutes in Game 4 of the first round against Detroit. The Hawks were eventually eliminated in 5 games, and Moncrief shelved his sneakers for good. In total, he made 5 All-Star teams, 5 All-NBA teams, 5 All-Defense teams, and was a 2-time Defensive Player of the Year winner, and is a Basketball Hall of Famer. Some of the greatest players of all time remember the impact of Moncrief quite well. For example, Michael Jordan said this about the Bucks star: "When you play against Moncrief, you're in for a night of all-around basketball. He'll hound you everywhere you go, both ends of the court. You just expect it." Larry Bird had this to say as well: "Moncrief does everything you're supposed to do on defense and doesn't take any shortcuts. Plus he does it every night." To me, what's mind-blowing is how he's rarely discussed among the greatest perimeter defenders in NBA history. Usually guys like Gary Payton, Michael Jordan, and even Kobe Bryant take all of the spotlight. But I think if you ask players who actually played against him in the 1980s, there's a very good chance that they have Moncrief in the top spot overall ahead of all those other legends. As for myself personally, well, it's tough to rank players defensively when there's so much nuance involved. At the very least, I have him as a top 5 perimeter defender on my all-time rankings.
What if I told you he was so much more than a man who simply sounds like the Cookie Monster? We all know him as Dikembe Mutombo, but technically, his full name is
Dikembe Mutombo Polanda Mukamba Diken Jean-Jacques Mutombo.
We know he has the iconic finger wag and he's a lovable personality, but just how good of a basketball player was he really? Well, let's start from the beginning. Mutombo came from the Democratic Republic of the Congo to attend Georgetown University at the age of 21. The crazy thing is, Mutombo attended Georgetown with the intent of becoming a doctor, but the Hoyas head coach John Thompson recruited him to play basketball. After 3 seasons in college, Mutombo entered the 1991 NBA draft, and the 7'2" center was selected with the 4th overall pick by the Denver Nuggets. The Nuggets were coming off of a season where they were the worst-ranked defense in the entire league. In that aspect, you couldn't have made a better addition than Mutombo, who as a 25-year-old rookie averaged 16.6 points, 12.3 rebounds, and 3 blocks on 49.3% shooting, good enough to make him an all-star that season. Pretty good for a rookie who wasn't even thinking about basketball just a few years earlier. Believe it or not, this rookie year was Dikembe's highest-scoring season of his career. He was never a great scorer, but that was also never something he truly focused on. Other than his rookie season, Dikembe never averaged more than 10 shots per game. He was capable, and he could contribute offensively, but he knew his skill set and his role, and he would continue to excel at it. His Nuggets still weren't winning many games, but in a year, they went from the worst defense in the league to the top half of the NBA, all thanks to Mutombo's impact with his blocks and rim protection in general. Over those next several years, he would continue to get better on the defensive end, and so would his team as a result. From 1993 to 1996, Mutombo averaged 12.1 points, 12.3 rebounds, and 4 blocks on 53.3% shooting. He led the league in block shots 3 out of those 4 seasons. In the 95-96 season specifically, he averaged an incredible 4.5 blocks. That's the 6th greatest single-season average in NBA history. And for Mutombo, that's only one of his 3 seasons that are in the top 20. In the 93-94 season, he was a critical factor in one of the greatest upsets in NBA playoff history. In the first round of the Western Conference playoffs, the first-seeded 63-19 Seattle Supersonics were taking on the 8th-seeded 42-40 Denver Nuggets. The Sonics were led by their superstar tandem of Gary Payton and Shawn Kemp, along with the help of solid players like Kendall Gill and Detlef Schrempf. The Nuggets had no business challenging these overpowered Sonics, but with their excellent team play, and with Mutombo playing out of his mind on defense, they pulled off the incredible by beating the Sonics in a hard-fought 5-game series. In that series, Mutombo put up his usual 12.6 points and 12.2 rebounds, but he was swatting almost everything with a monstrous 6.2 blocks per game. They nearly made a second huge upset in the next round, but ultimately lost to the Malone and Stockton Utah Jazz in 7 games. At the end of the 1996 season, Mutombo wanted a long and well-paying contract from the Nuggets, but the general manager of the Nuggets, Bernie Bickerstaff, was unwilling to make such an offer since the Nuggets were struggling just to be in the playoff picture. So they let Mutombo walk, a move that the GM has since said is the biggest regret of his career. Instead, Mutombo signed with the Atlanta Hawks on a 5-year, $55 million deal. Over the next 2 seasons, Mutombo continued to be the defensive anchor and averaged 13.4 points, 11.5 rebounds, and 3.3 blocks on 53.2% shooting. He was an all-star both seasons and won his 2nd and 3rd Defensive Player of the Year awards in those years. Behind the leadership of Mutombo and his all-star teammate Steve Smith, the Hawks had back-to-back 50-win seasons. They even made it to the second round of the 1997 NBA playoffs before losing to Jordan and Pippen's Bulls in 5 games. On December 14, 1999, Mutombo had one of the best games of his career against the Minnesota Timberwolves. He dropped 27 points, 29 rebounds, and 6 blocks on 100% shooting. That's right, you heard me correctly. Mutombo scored 27 points on 11 of 11 shooting and then simply threw in 27 boards and 6 blocks. The stat line just looks goofy if I'm being honest. Unfortunately, the Hawks were beginning to disappoint and weren't making appearances in the playoffs any longer. So at the 2001 trade deadline, they dealt Mutombo to the Philadelphia 76ers, who were in desperate need of a solid center after Theo Ratliff went down to injury. Now, all of you knowledgeable NBA fans know that Allen Iverson carried the 76ers offensively that year in his MVP campaign. But what many people forget is just how good their defense was, and Mutombo led the way on that end. Dikembe was named the Defensive Player of the Year for the 4th time, with averages of 10 points, 13.5 rebounds, and 2.7 blocks on 48.4% shooting. A great example of Mutombo's impact came in Game 7 of the 2001 Eastern Conference Finals against the talented Milwaukee Bucks. Iverson scored a clutch 44 points, which naturally gets all the attention, but Mutombo also excelled in his role. dropping 23 points, 19 rebounds, and 7 blocks, which was more than enough to send the 76ers to the NBA Finals before they were eventually eliminated in 5 games to the Los Angeles Lakers. Mutombo was an All-Star once again the following season, but he was entering his late 30s, and his decline was sharp and soon after that. He finished out his career playing for New Jersey, New York, and Houston. He was an 8-time All-Star, won 2 rebounding titles and 3 blocks titles. His 4 Defensive Player of the Year awards is the most in NBA history, tied with Ben Wallace. Here's kind of a weird stat, but of the triple-doubles that specifically include points, rebounds, and blocks, Dikembe has the second most in NBA history. He ranks high on many all-time lists, despite the fact that he was a 25-year-old rookie. If he had been in the NBA any earlier, he would be even higher. So now that we've reflected on his career, we again ask the question, just how good was Dikembe Mutombo really? Well, he certainly didn't have the most polished offensive game, and he wasn't consistently a standout scorer, but he was a reliable teammate, the ideal rim protector, and clearly one of the greatest ever on the defensive end. He played with a tenacity and a fierceness that any team could appreciate. Let me know in the comments section where you rank Dikembe Mutombo among the greatest defenders of all time.
When I ask you who are the greatest scorers of the 1990s, what names come to mind? Jordan, Robinson, Barkley, Malone, Miller? All good answers, but one of the most overlooked scorers of that decade is almost never mentioned in the discussion, even though he should be. Mitch "The Rock" Richmond. Mitch was a 6'5" shooting guard who was drafted in 1988 with the 5th overall pick by the Golden State Warriors. His impact was felt immediately as Richmond had one of the greatest rookie campaigns of that decade. In his debut season, Mitch averaged 22 points, 5.9 rebounds, and 4.2 assists on 47% shooting. For years to come after that, Richmond was the model of consistency for a scoring two-guard as he averaged over 20 points per game in each of his first 10 seasons in the league. He was a fantastic three-point shooter as he shot 39% from distance over the course of his career. To give you an idea of just how good of a perimeter shooter he was, let me put it this way. Larry Bird and Dirk Nowitzki are considered as 2 of the greatest shooters in NBA history. Mitch Richmond was not only more efficient than these 2 at three-pointers, but he also averaged more three-point attempts per game than these 2 legends. He's easily one of the most underrated snipers of NBA history. Stretching the floor was far from his only skill though. He was also a strong guard who wasn't afraid to post up and take advantage of the weaker players on the block. That is, after all, how he earned his nickname, The Rock. During Mitch's first 3 seasons in the NBA, he was a member of the Warriors well before Golden State had established themselves as a premier franchise. These seasons would be the closest Richmond would get to leading a contending team while he was in his prime. That Warriors team was led by Tim Hardaway, Mitch Richmond, and Chris Mullin under head coach Don Nelson. They were an exciting and fast-paced offense, frequently referred to as Run TMC. Their best playoff run came in the 1991 season, but unfortunately they were eliminated in the second round of the playoffs by the eventual Western Conference champions, the Los Angeles Lakers. The following season, in a move that still confuses me to this day with its absurdity, the Warriors traded Mitch Richmond to the Sacramento Kings in exchange for the draft rights to the big man Billy Owens, who didn't end up being nearly as good of a player as Richmond. Mitch continued his star production as a King, and from 1993 to 1998, he was an All-Star each year, including the 1995 All-Star Game in Phoenix, where he was named the game's MVP. One of the reasons that Richmond is frequently so overlooked despite his talent and accomplishments, in my opinion, is honestly because he was simply cursed with bad franchises. His best years he spent with the Warriors, Kings, and Wizards, which were all far from serious contending organizations in both the 80s and 90s. In fact, out of his 14 years in the league, in only 3 of those seasons did he actually have a winning record. The first 2 were with the Run TMC Warriors, and the third was in his final season as a member of the Shaq and Kobe Lakers. By that point, Mitch was 36 years old and was only averaging 4 points a game, yet despite his small contribution, Mitch was able to finish out his career with an NBA championship. With his consistent scoring throughout his career and his all-time great shooting, Mitch solidified his Hall of Fame status when he was elected in 2014. Despite his amazing talent, you rarely hear people talk about this guy, and in my opinion, he's a worthy candidate for the title of the most underrated player in NBA history.
Oscar Palmer Robertson. Most of you know who this legend of NBA history is. the first player to ever average a triple-double over the course of a season, and still just one of only 2 players to ever accomplish the feat. But many people nowadays struggle to grasp the skill and legacy of Oscar. Just how good was this guy? Was he just a selfish stat patter? Was he just a pretty good player who took advantage of a less advanced era? He also doesn't have many recognizably iconic highlights. All of these questions and unknowns make it difficult for many NBA fans to put his talent in perspective and figure out where he ranks among the greatest players of all time. That's where this video comes in, as we're diving into the career and evaluating the legacy of the man known as the Big O. Oscar Robertson was selected with the first overall pick in the 1960 NBA draft by the Cincinnati Royals. As a 22-year-old, Oscar was entering the NBA as one of the most pro-league ready rookies the game has ever seen. He was a 6'5" point guard with a strong build, and he knew how to use it. In his rookie campaign, Oscar took the league by storm, averaging 30.5 points, 10.1 rebounds, and 9.7 assists on 47.3% shooting in what is easily one of the greatest rookie seasons of all time. It pretty much goes without saying that he was that year's Rookie of the Year winner. Oscar's game wasn't flashy by any means. We recognize that today, but they knew it then too. There were certainly more exciting styles among his peers at the point guard position, but Oscar preferred a more patient and methodical approach, which doesn't translate to the most awe-inspiring highlights 60 years later. But it was effective, and that's what mattered. Many times, Oscar would simply back down his opponents and score from the post, using his IQ and his reliable jump shot. Scoring was just one of his many gifts though. Another area he dominated was on the boards, as he used his anticipation and low center of gravity to secure his high rebounding numbers. Oscar's rebounding is a skill of his that I don't think he gets enough credit for, and there's several reasons for this. For one, in recent videos on this channel, we've talked about how rebounding numbers were inflated in the 1960s. The pace of play was faster at the time, which meant more shot attempts, and more shot attempts equals more rebounds. Not only that, but the league as a whole didn't shoot as efficiently back then, which means even more rebounds. That's why there were usually a handful of players averaging near 20 rebounds per game in that era. With that being said, you'd still be wrong to simply disregard Oscar's elite rebounding abilities, because although it was normal for players to get incredibly high rebounding numbers in that era, it wasn't normal for players like Oscar. In each of his first 5 seasons in the league, Oscar finished in the top 20 of rebounds per game leaders, ranking as high as 9th place overall. In each of those 5 seasons, Oscar was the only guard to finish in the top 20 in rebounds. With the game played more around the interior in those days, the rebounding department was dominated almost exclusively by all the big centers and forwards, but Oscar was the anomaly. And of course, we can't leave out his playmaking abilities, as he had great court vision, was a fantastic passer, and was constantly among the league leaders in assists. By only his sophomore season, Oscar was ready to have the year that would make him famous for decades to come, as he put up triple-double averages of 30.8 points, 12.5 rebounds, and 11.4 assists on 47.8% shooting, leading the Royals to their first winning season in 8 years. This iconic achievement made him a legend, as he was the only person to ever achieve the feat up until Russell Westbrook did it in 2017. But the craziest part is his triple-double achievement is actually so much better than people realize. Technically, 1962 was the only single season of his career where he averaged a triple-double, but he came very close to doing it several times. Some years, his assists would be well over 10, but the rebounds would be well below 10. And some years, the assists would be below 10, and the rebounds would be well over 10. Over the course of his first 5 seasons of his career, he averaged 30.3 points, 10.6 assists, and 10.4 rebounds on 48.6% shooting. That is ridiculous. So although he's famous for averaging a triple-double for a season, in reality, he averaged a triple-double for 5 seasons. Despite his constant incredible play, when it came to the playoffs, the Royals were constantly being eliminated at the hands of the far more talented Boston Celtics and Philadelphia 76ers. This ongoing theme of putting up monstrous numbers just to lose in the playoffs started to build some negative narratives about Oscar as a player, whether they were deserved or not. Some were starting to say that he had a selfish style, and that he was too ball dominant, and that he needed to be more comfortable in a free-flowing offense where he isn't calling all the shots. Although he remained extremely productive for years, with all of these narratives and stigmas going on, and with plenty of tension in the locker room for a number of reasons, the relationship between him and the Royals began to sour, and eventually he was traded to the Milwaukee Bucks. At this point, this was basically the best thing that could have happened to an aging Oscar Robertson, because after being with a mediocre supporting cast for years, in Milwaukee, he would be joining a young and dominant Lou Alcindor, before he became Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. The combination of the 23-year-old Lou Alcindor in the interior and the 32-year-old Oscar orchestrating from the perimeter was a tandem that was ready to dominate the basketball world, and that's exactly what they did. At one point, the Bucks won 20 straight games, which was an NBA record at the time. They finished the regular season with a 66-16 record, while bolstering the league's best offense and the best defense. Although Oscar's numbers had significantly dipped now that he was sharing the floor with Alcindor, it was a sacrifice he was more than happy to make in order to win, and they kept doing that into the postseason. They crushed the Warriors in 5 games, crushed the Lakers in 5 games, and then swept the Baltimore Bullets in the NBA Finals, with Oscar putting up 23, 9, and 5 on 52% shooting. He had finally won that elusive championship, cementing his already impressive NBA legacy. When it comes to the respect he gets among his contemporaries, it was basically as high as it gets, but amongst the community of NBA fans, he's not quite appreciated to the same extent, and that's a tragedy. He might not have the flashiest game, he might not be dunking from the free throw line, but at the end of the day, he got it done.
David Maurice Robinson, also known as the Admiral. Robinson was a lean and strong 7'1" center who was a force on both sides of the basketball. His greatest days were throughout the 90s, where it was easy to sometimes be overshadowed amidst all of the elite bigs at the time. In Robinson's prime, he had to compete in the paint with the likes of Shaq, Hakeem Olajuwon, Patrick Ewing, Alonzo Mourning, and Dikembe Mutombo. Despite the stiff competition, David managed to put up some incredible numbers over his career, worthy of the Basketball Hall of Fame. But the question is, just how good was Robinson really? Where does he rank among the great centers of his era, and among the greatest centers of all time? To answer that question, let's start at the beginning of his career. Robinson was drafted in 1987 with the first overall pick by the San Antonio Spurs. Unfortunately for the Spurs, Robinson was still serving in the US Navy, and the team had to wait 2 years before Robinson would actually make his debut with the organization. Turns out the wait was well worth it. Robinson's 1989 rookie campaign is still one of the greatest rookie seasons in NBA history. The year before Robinson made his debut for San Antonio, the Spurs were terrible and were the 3rd worst team in the league with a record of 21-61. There were several major additions following that ugly season, but the biggest one was the 24-year-old rookie they called the Admiral. And under his leadership and impact, the Spurs made what was at the time the greatest improvement in NBA history, going from a 21-61 team to an elite 56-26 team, which was good enough for the 3rd best record in the Western Conference. When you take a look at Robinson's numbers that year, it's pretty clear how the Spurs were able to make such an improvement. As a rookie, he played all 82 games, averaged 24.3 points, 12 rebounds, and an absurd 3.9 blocks per game while shooting 53% from the field. He led the team all the way to the Western Conference semifinals, where they ultimately lost in 7 games to the Western Conference champion Portland Trail Blazers. From that point on, Robinson's monstrous career wasn't looking back. From 1989 to 1996, he averaged 25.6 points, 11.8 rebounds, and 3.6 blocks on 53% shooting, and he was an all-star each of those years. He started piling up accolades as well. In 1991, he was the rebounds champion. In 1992, he was the Defensive Player of the Year while averaging a historic 4.5 blocks per game. That's the 7th highest single-season average in NBA history. With a block per game average that high, imagine how many shots he altered that season. He's basically the definition of the ideal rim protector. He was a scoring champion in 1994, averaging 29.8 points per game, and he was the league MVP in 1995. He was arguably the best big man on both sides of the ball during his prime. Year in and year out, he was in the discussion, although of course there were times other bigs got the best of him. The biggest example of this was in the 1995 Western Conference Finals between Hakeem's Rockets and Robinson's Spurs. Hakeem was out of his mind that series and averaged 35 points, 12 rebounds, 5 assists, 1.3 steals, and 4.2 blocks, while Robinson just put up his usual numbers. Many have used this series as a criticism to Robinson's legacy, but I honestly think that's a bit ridiculous. Hakeem is a top 5 center of all time. Him having a historic performance over another great center should be more of a praise to Hakeem than it is a criticism to his opponent. In the years after that, Robinson looked to bounce back, but a back injury early in the 1997 season made that difficult. He missed most of that season, but eventually returned to play in just 6 regular season games before he then broke his foot. His championship hopes seemed to be over, with the Spurs finishing as a 20-62 team that year. Oddly enough, this actually turned out to be a blessing in disguise. Thanks to that poor season, they had a spot in the draft lottery, and they struck gold by landing the first overall pick, which then became the legendary Tim Duncan. Robinson now had the second superstar he needed to break through, and in only their second season together, they won the 1999 NBA championship. He won his second championship in the 2003 season. At this point, Robinson was only making a small contribution of 8 points and 8 rebounds, but under Duncan's lead, it was enough to get it done once again. Robinson's championships came in the twilight of his career, but his accolades came earlier on when he appeared to be one of the most dominant two-way players in NBA history. A prime Robinson could basically do it all, and no game better symbolized that than on February 17, 1994 against the Detroit Pistons. In this contest, David had 34 points, 10 rebounds, 10 assists, and 10 blocks, giving him the illustrious quadruple-double. In the history of the NBA, only 4 players have ever recorded a quadruple-double. In total, he was a 10-time All-Star, made 10 All-NBA teams, and made 8 All-Defense teams to go along with his MVP, Defensive Player of the Year award, and his 2 NBA championships. He was an elite scorer, rebounder, and defender, and he has the 4th highest career blocks per game average of all time. If you're in a discussion about the greatest centers of NBA history, you'll hear the usual names, like Russell, Chamberlain, Kareem, Shaq, and Hakeem. That's a solid top 5. But if Robinson isn't one of the next 2 names you add to that list, well then quite frankly, that's a crime in my mind. Let me know in the comments section where you rank David Robinson, and let me know if you think he would be the best big in the game if he played today. When you think of the late 2000s, a handful of superstars usually come to mind. Kobe Bryant on his quest to win rings without Shaq, LeBron James in his peak Cleveland form, Dwayne Wade carrying Miami, Dwight Howard in his prime, and the Boston Celtics Big Three causing havoc in the Eastern Conference. But one player who's since been forgotten by many was the Portland Trail Blazers' former star, Brandon Roy. Roy is yet another example of a star who had potential that reached the sky, but unfortunately, severe injuries ruined that potential and kept him from having a long and healthy career. Even though Roy's career was ultimately cut extremely short, many of us still got to witness his incredible talent on display, and I'm here to tell you about it. He was a 6'6" shooting guard who was selected with the 6th overall pick in the 2006 NBA draft by the Minnesota Timberwolves. Although Minnesota selected him, Portland had the next pick and was hoping to draft Roy after he had an excellent pre-draft workout with the team. Due to this, Portland mustered up a trade package that included the rights to draft Randy Foye, and Minnesota agreed to the deal, sending Brandon to the Blazers to begin his career. At this point, the Blazers organization was in desperate need of a spark, as they had missed the playoffs the previous few seasons and were coming off a year where they had the worst record in the entire league. Due to this, there was no time to develop Brandon slowly, as they were immediately plugging him into the starting lineup and giving him a full workload of minutes. He immediately made a strong first impression as he scored 20 points in his first game against his hometown team, the Seattle Supersonics, and in his second game, he poured in 19, 6, and 5 against the Golden State Warriors. He had a silky smooth game that didn't rely much on athleticism, but instead on his skills and fundamentals. I wouldn't describe him as explosive, but as methodical and intelligent. He had an elite handle on the basketball and had a lethal pull-up jumper. He also had a quick first step and was a fantastic finisher in the paint. To put it simply, he was an isolation nightmare for the opposing defender. At the end of his debut season, he had improved Portland's record by 11 wins over the previous season, and was rewarded with the Rookie of the Year trophy. In his rookie campaign, he had a stat line average of 16.8 points, 4.4 rebounds, 4 assists, and 1.2 steals on 45.6% shooting. Beginning with his sophomore season, Roy's production, skills, and confidence would improve significantly, as he was named an NBA All-Star 3 seasons straight. At his regular season peak, he was averaging about 23 points, 5 rebounds, and 5 assists on 48% shooting. and a solid 37.7% from three-point range. Not only that, but Roy was quickly establishing himself as one of the most clutch players in the entire league, as his elite one-on-one capabilities were consistently paying off in fourth quarter situations. This was especially the case in the 08-09 season, where he had numerous game winners and finished that season among the league leaders in fourth quarter shots made in one-possession games. The most iconic of those was the sequence against the Rockets, where he hit a tough jumper with only a few seconds left, which he then followed up with a deep three buzzer beater to win the contest. Throughout the regular season, he had numerous other evenings where he caught the attention of the basketball world, like on December 18th, where he dropped 52 points, 6 assists, and 5 rebounds against the contending Phoenix Suns, and also on January 24th against the Washington Wizards, where he achieved a franchise record 10 steals. Later in that postseason is where he truly displayed what he was capable of. It was the first round of the 2009 Western Conference playoffs against the Houston Rockets, and Roy was torching elite defenders like Ron Artest and Shane Battier. In Game 2, he dropped a monstrous 42 points and 7 rebounds on 55.6% shooting, leading his Blazers to a 4-point victory. On the series as a whole, he averaged 26.7 points, 4.8 rebounds, 1.3 steals, and 1.2 blocks on 46% shooting and 47% from three-point range. As a player in his early 20s, this was the absolute peak of his powers, and the sky was the limit as he was rewarded with a max contract from the Blazers organization. Sadly, this was as good as it got, as it was only downhill from this point on. In the 2010 season, Roy suffered his first major knee injury in the NBA, as he suffered a bone contusion and a meniscus tear. Later on, it was discovered that Roy was missing a significant amount of cartilage in his knees, which required arthroscopic knee surgery on both knees. Unfortunately, even these surgeries weren't enough to save his career. Roy said that his knees had degenerated to such a point that there wasn't any cartilage between the bones in both of his knees. Due to this, he retired from the game of basketball at only the age of 26. A couple years later, he tried to make a comeback, but he only played a total of 5 games as a member of the Minnesota Timberwolves and made very minor contributions. Sadly, what ended the comeback was yet another injury to his right knee, which was initially only supposed to sideline him for a month. But the injury ultimately proved to be too severe, as it kept him out for several months before Minnesota was done waiting and decided to release him, which was unfortunately the final nail in the coffin of his career. Despite being done with basketball while still in his 20s, Roy kept a positive attitude and said this after his release: "Anytime you walk away from the game, you have what ifs. I feel like I was able to answer those questions last year by going out there and giving it a try." At his peak, Roy was one of the most dangerous players in the game, and even the legendary Kobe Bryant agreed, as he stated in 2010 that Roy was the hardest player to guard in the Western Conference, and he had no weaknesses in his game.
Before there were high flyers like Russell Westbrook, Blake Griffin, Vince Carter, and even Michael Jordan, there was a 6'8" small forward from the Atlanta Hawks who assaulted the rim with his thunderous slams in such a way that the league had never seen before. Dominique Wilkins, aka the human highlight film. A man who was ahead of his time with his jaw-dropping athletic ability and terrific finishes above the rim. Dominique had been selected 3rd overall in the 1982 draft by the Utah Jazz, but was later traded to the Atlanta Hawks, whose management had seen superstar potential in the young small forward, and did they ever get it right. Dominique took the NBA by storm, destroying NBA centers and posterizing all those who chose to stand between him and the rim. Just a few years into the league, Dominique was the franchise cornerstone of the Atlanta Hawks. He won the 1985 Slam Dunk Contest over conference rival Michael Jordan, and in the following season, he led the league in scoring with 30.3 points per game. This was a year with scoring juggernauts like Larry Bird and Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, and Dominique outscored all of them that year. Back in those days, anytime Dominique and the Hawks matched up against Larry Bird and the Celtics or Michael Jordan and the Bulls, everyone knew they were in for an epic solo duel between the best wing players in the league. Classic battles where they would score 40 or even 50 points, trading basket after basket in a display of sheer competitive drive between the two players. The biggest battle came in the form of Game 7 of the 1988 Eastern Conference semifinals between Bird's Celtics and Dominique's Hawks, a game that will go down as one of the greatest games in NBA history. Dominique finished with 47 points and Bird had 34, with 20 of those coming in the fourth quarter, and the Celtics narrowly beat the Hawks 118-116. By the time the 1990 NBA season had rolled around, Dominique had carried his Hawks to 4 straight 50-plus win seasons. He was one of the most respected and feared players in the game, but had never managed to get over the hump of winning an NBA championship. In the 1991-92 season, Dominique Wilkins' success came to an abrupt halt when he ruptured his Achilles tendon only halfway through the season. Dominique and the players around the league were devastated by the tragic news, but this did not break Dominique's will and competitive drive. He worked vigorously to make a speedy recovery and to get back to competing for that elusive championship. Dominique was ready at the start of the 1992-93 season, and what ensued was likely the greatest comeback from an Achilles injury that the league had ever seen. Dominique looked like his old self, finishing the regular season with averages of 29.9 points, 6.8 rebounds, and 3.2 assists, while shooting nearly 47% from the field. He also made a career-high 123 pointers on the season on 38% shooting from that distance, officially destroying the myth that Dominique was simply a dunker. Dominique had also managed to pass Bob Pettit's 20,880 points to become the Atlanta Hawks' all-time leading scorer. The Hawks had squeaked their way into the playoffs with a 42-40 record. It was good enough for the 8th seed, but ultimately they were swept 3-0 by Jordan and the defending champion Chicago Bulls. The 1993-94 season rolls along, and Dominique continues to assert himself as one of the premier players in the league. But with his contract ending at the end of the season, and Wilkins quickly approaching his 35th birthday, the Atlanta Hawks made a shocking decision by trading their star and former franchise cornerstone for the younger Danny Manning. The move was emotionally devastating to Wilkins, whose heart and soul had been captured by the Atlanta fan base. Wilkins finished the year strong, averaging nearly 30 points in his final 25 games as an LA Clipper, but after that season was over, Wilkins' career would never be the same. He finished his NBA career as a shell of himself and journeyman, playing for the Celtics, Spurs, and Magic. Reflecting on Wilkins' career, it's clear that he was one of the greatest scorers in NBA history. He was one of only 8 players in NBA history to average at least 25 points per game in 10 consecutive seasons. That's a feat scoring legends like Kobe Bryant, Wilt Chamberlain, and Larry Bird never even accomplished. The other 7 players who accomplished that feat were Michael Jordan, Jerry West, Shaquille O'Neal, Karl Malone, Allen Iverson, Kevin Durant, and LeBron James. That's a pretty dang good company if you ask me. He's the man known as the human highlight film, the all-time leading scorer in Hawks history, an NBA slam dunk champion, and one of the greatest individual foes of Michael Jordan and Larry Bird in the 80s. Former Boston Celtic player and now general manager Danny Ainge spoke for many great players from Wilkins' playing days when he said, "Dominique wasn't selected as one of the 50 greatest players of NBA history, but to me, he's top 25. I might have to agree with him, to be honest. Wilkins proved he had everything it takes in the modern NBA to dominate the league. He was a quick forward with lots of length, transcendent athleticism, and he was a sharpshooter later on in his career. Ultimately, he's another case of simply entering the league at the wrong time and on the wrong team. Otherwise, he wouldn't have been so overlooked. When Dominique was drafted in 1982 with the 3rd overall pick, he was passed up by the Lakers, who had the 1st overall pick and took the only small forward taken ahead of Dominique, which was James Worthy. Big Game James was a legend in his own right and won multiple championships with the Lakers. But one can only imagine what Dominique and the Lakers would have been like if they were together in the 80s and early 90s. Can you imagine Dominique on the fast break receiving no-look passes from Magic Johnson himself? Think about all the lob passes that would be getting thrown his way as well. Instead, Dominique was a legend in Atlanta for a Hawks team stuck in a conference of super teams. What the Western Conference is today is what the Eastern Conference was in the 80s. Sure, you had the Lakers out west, but the majority of the strength in the league was in the Eastern Conference, with the likes of Larry Bird, Kevin McHale, and Robert Parrish on the Celtics, Moses Malone, Dr. J, and Charles Barkley on the 76ers, Isaiah Thomas, Joe Dumars, and Dennis Rodman on the Pistons, and Michael Jordan and Scottie Pippen on the Bulls. The East in the 80s was absolutely stacked at the top, and unfortunately, Wilkins and his Hawks simply didn't have enough firepower to compete. Let me know in the comments section where you rank Dominique Wilkins among the greatest small forwards in NBA history. Lately, I've been hearing a lot of people discussing and comparing the greatest NBA duos of all time. Shaq always loves bringing up this conversation on social media, which makes sense because he thinks him and Kobe were the best duo. Most people think it was Jordan and Pippen, and then some people will bring up Magic and Kareem. But honestly, the suggestion of them always bothered me a little bit, because the majority of Kareem and Magic's time together, they were not simply a duo, they were a trio. The third overlooked and disregarded superstar in that trio was Big Game James Worthy. But just how good was he really? Well, let's start by taking it back to the beginning of his career. Thanks to a trade the Lakers had made several years earlier, they had the first overall pick in the 1982 NBA draft, and with it, they took James Worthy from the University of North Carolina. He was a skilled 6'9" small forward who was quick and aggressive and often was on the receiving end of a Magic Johnson-led fast break. The high-octane, fast-paced, showtime offense of the 80s Lakers, together with the fast slasher that is James Worthy, was basically a match made in heaven. He still had some growing to do though, and he spent his rookie season coming off of the bench providing an offensive spark for Los Angeles. In that first season, he averaged 13.4 points, 5.2 rebounds, 1.7 assists, and 1.2 steals on an extremely efficient 57.9% shooting. Efficiency would be a theme of Worthy's career throughout. He didn't take many shots from a great distance, and he rarely took any stupid or highly contested shots. He was smart with a high offensive IQ who relied on either the fast break or his low post game in half-court sets. He was another one of those fundamentally sound legends who possessed fantastic footwork. You just don't hear people bring it up much. In Worthy's first 2 seasons with the Lakers, they lost in the NBA Finals to the 76ers and the Boston Celtics. But it was his third year in the league where James really began to break out and make a name for himself, and in turn, the Lakers were ready to make the most of it. As a 23-year-old, he had secured his place as the Lakers' starting small forward, and the Lakers dominated, finishing with a 62-20 record for the best record in the Western Conference. It was his best season yet, behind averages of 17.6 points, 6.4 rebounds, and 2.5 assists on 57.2% shooting. His regular season was pretty good, but he earned his Big Game James nickname in the 1985 playoffs. He thrived in that postseason, averaging 21.5 points, 5.1 rebounds, and 2.1 assists on a remarkable 62.3% shooting, almost unprecedented efficiency coming from a small forward. After their victory over the Celtics in 6 games, he was an NBA champion and had established himself as one of the clutch performers of the league. This would be just the start though. His next season would be his first of 7 straight All-Star seasons. Over that period of time, James would average 20.3 points, 5.3 rebounds, and 3.5 assists on 52.7% shooting. He was quite often the second and sometimes the first scoring option for the Lakers during that stretch. He continued the trend of being a great player, but in the playoffs, he consistently went from being simply a great player to an all-time great player. There's no shortage of epic postseason performances, like Game 3 of the 1987 Western Conference Finals against the Supersonics, where he dropped 39 points, 5 rebounds, and 5 assists on 64% shooting, which was good enough to get the Lakers a 1-point victory. Over that entire 1987 Western Conference Finals, he averaged 30.5 points on 60% shooting, and no other Laker averaged above 20 points. Even in seasons where they came up short, he still played like a monster, like in Game 4 of the 1989 NBA Finals against the Pistons. Byron Scott and Magic Johnson were out due to injuries, and James rose to the occasion, scoring 40 points on 65% shooting in a heroic effort. His defining moment, though, came in the 1988 NBA Finals. This was the Lakers' 5th and final championship run of the 1980s, and it would be a hard-fought 7-game series against the Bad Boys of Detroit, led by Isaiah Thomas, Joe Dumars, and Bill Laimbeer. The final 2 games of this series would be decided by 1 basket, and the Laker who shined brightest in the most crucial games of their season was not the captain, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, it was not the face of Showtime, Magic Johnson, it was the overlooked member of the dynamic trio, Big Game James Worthy. In Game 6, James was the Lakers' leading scorer, putting up 28 points, 9 rebounds, and 4 assists on 54% shooting. In Game 7, he took it to the next level, and he absolutely had to, as he played one of the greatest Game 7s in NBA history, dropping 36 points, 16 rebounds, and 10 assists on 68% shooting. The Lakers needed every single one of those statistics to win the deciding game by just 3 points. I think it goes without saying that Big Game James is one of the most well-deserved nicknames there is. Now, as a lifelong Lakers fan, I have to ask, how the hell did this man accomplish all of this, put Los Angeles on his back to win the 1988 NBA championship, and yet does not have a statue in his honor outside of Staples Center? This legend isn't just criminally overlooked in the basketball community, but he's even overlooked in our own Laker nation. So just how good was James Worthy really? Well, he isn't incredibly high on many of the all-time statistical lists, but he was a key and vital star in the Lakers' Showtime dynasty. He had a unique and efficient skill set, and he was one of the most clutch players to ever play the game of basketball. Let me know in the comments section how good James Worthy was in your own words. Thanks for watching as always, make sure to like and subscribe for more NBA content, and I'll see you guys in the next video.